Good afternoon. Thanks for joining us this afternoon. The first item on the work session today is a proclamation for Forget-Me-Not Month. We have Ralph Tagg here from the Disabled American Veterans and also JR. If you guys would join me up here in the proclamation. I'll just speak really loud.
Wait, where is the mic?
I'm okay. Mic right here.
Okay.
Bob?
Oh.
Okay. All right. Good. All right, the proclamation for Forget-Me-Not Month, September 2018. Whereas the Disabled American Veterans Organization offers a variety of free services to disabled veterans and their families. And whereas each year the Disabled American Veterans Organization holds a Forget-Me-Not drive where all proceeds raised are given to those disabled veterans and their families who are in need. And whereas the City of Hagerstown expresses their gratitude to those disabled veterans who valiantly fought to protect our freedom and preserve our way of life. Now therefore be it resolved with the support of the City of Hagerstown, I, Robert E. Barucci II, Mayor of the City of Hagerstown, Maryland, do hereby proclaim the month of September 18th, 2018 as Forget-Me-Not Month and encourage our citizens to support the Forget-Me-Not Drive, which supports our local disabled veterans and their families.
This gentleman here is the incoming. Okay. This gentleman here on my right is the incoming commander, and I'm J.R. Arnold. I'm the outgoing commander. So every year to year and a half, we kick people out and bring new people in. So anyway, he's in charge now, and he'll be the man. If you have any questions, he can answer.
Yeah. First, I want to thank the mayor and the council here for the proclamation, which they do every year for our Forget-Me-Not Drive. And we give back to the community, and we really appreciate the support that the city gives us. And I want to thank the mayor and everyone else here for the opportunity to serve as commander at the DAV. And our Forget-Me-Not Drive will really be a success. And of course, the proceeds will go to the needy in the community. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much.
Okay, Mayor.
JR.
Thank you.
Yeah. Hey guys, come here. Put my tie on.
You just clap for them? Yes.
All right, thank you, sir. Thank you very much.
All right. Chief Lohr, want to come forward? For Washington County Fire and Emergency Medical Services Study Final Report conducted by VFIS Education Training Consulting. I know Dr. William Genoway will not be here this evening. Steve, you're going to introduce some people and have them up to the table.
I will, Mr. Mayor, thank you. The plan originally was to have Dr. Genoway do a overview of the VFIS study that's in front of Mayor and Council this evening. So at the last minute, he became ill this morning. I'd like to introduce two people that are no strangers to Mayor and Council. The first who will be doing the presentation is Director Dave Hayes from Washington County Division Emergency Services. Second is President Dale Hill of the Washington County Volunteer Fire Rescue Association. Well, so in respect to time, I'll let Dave walk you through the presentation that was given to the Board of County Commissioners this morning.
Thank you.
Good evening.
Welcome, Dave.
It is evening, right? It's been a whirlwind day, so thank you very much for allowing us to come and do the overview. As many know, this is a much anticipated and long-awaited result from a study that was begun back in March of 2017, specifically March 28th. So as Chief had stated, I'll do my best to ad-lib in Dr. Genoway's place, but some of the information that we're going to cover today was authored by VFIS and his team. So while we may not be able to speak totally fluent to all topics, I think we can at least speak somewhat intelligently to most. We're going to ad lib. You have a handout that is a PowerPoint presentation. We'll go through about 5 pages, the first 5 pages. Earlier today, I actually went through the backside of that. But I think in essence of time and for the fluid presentation of the information, I'm going to flip over to the actual study to go through the recommendations. So give you a little history. When I came to the division back in February of 2016, the one thing I had been hearing prior to, and certainly as I came into the division, was a want from the commissioners for a plan. We had a fire plan and we had an emergency medical services plan and several other derivatives in between there, but they asked for a plan that would help them look forward as to what the needs might be for the emergency services. And I think they recognize, much like you and I do, and the fire chief here, and certainly the association, that the face of the emergency services is changing. Historically, it's been predominantly, specifically here in Washington County, delivered by an almost all-volunteer workforce. But over the last 5 to 10 years, much of that's began to change. And some of it's societal, meaning the work that parents have to do and where the children are, and we're transient society now. So we used to live, work, and retire in our community that we were born in, and that's not so much the case anymore. So where we need to be as leaders and kind of the folks that have to plan strategically for things that in some cases will get very expensive, we need to be at the front of that and looking forward, trying to figure out where we're going, and not necessarily just sitting back where we are and thinking that that's going to be the norm, because as we find in many things in society, it's not. You know, I've certainly seen that in even my 2.5 years here as director. So going forward, the commissioners authored or authorized the expenditure of $47,500 to contract VFIS. We did the contract through the association, and it was with concurrence of the association and the vendor that we felt would provide the easiest path forward for us. They are also, if you don't know, the current insurance provider for casualty, property and casualty for the volunteer stations throughout Washington County. So going forward, what we saw in the study, this is going through several drafts, and most of it was to bring statistical information and just formatting into line so that it was accurate to the information that they had requested from sources within Washington County. But it was an evaluation and a process that was systematic. They interviewed all 26 companies. The companies selected who would be the representative to speak to the consultant group. They interviewed myself and our staff, the chairperson of the ESAC, and then the Volunteer Fire and Rescue Association was interviewed as well. Likewise, the Hagerstown Fire Department. And so that I'm not remiss and get carried on into this study, I want to take a moment to thank the Mayor and Council and the Hagerstown Fire Chief for being willing to participate for the first time that I know of in a collective study that encumbered the entire boundary of Washington County. We didn't have a hole called Hagerstown or vice versa. It wasn't Hagerstown doing the study and the county wasn't included. We may not like the results, we may not like all of them at least, but nonetheless, they're necessary conversations, and they're things that are designed to create intuitive thinking and thinking outside of the box. And that's really where we're going to have to go as a service community. So the one thing the study did do, it challenged individuals to think and look critically at paradigms and values, philosophies, beliefs, and desires. What we want may not be what we can have, is kind of where that ends up being. So it also provided those involved with the opportunity to participate in the development of the long-term direction and focus for the emergency services in whole. And some of that comes into play here, and I know I was at a work session several months ago where the city and county had dialogue relative to how can we help each other in some of these things, because the costs of these services are enormous, and they're going to even get larger because of some of the dynamics called career staffing, and where we're going to have to augment volunteers here and there. But what the charge for the study group was basically to evaluate the financial planning, the field operations, meaning the service delivery side of it, and then planning and evaluate standards of cover, response times, station locations, the administration and management, and that includes the administration and management of our offices, likewise with the volunteer groups in whole as well. We looked at standard operating practices, facilities, apparatus, and equipment to include, are they in the right places? Do we have enough or do we have too much? And then also the cost of those. How do we sustain the cost values in buying and replacing apparatus in a regular schedule so that we're not running apparatus that might be 30 or 35 years old. That is at least an example in one case within the county. Operations and special operations, we looked at mutual aid, both inside the county, meaning Hagerstown to the county, and vice versa, the county to Hagerstown, and then likewise outside of the county, whether that's within the state of Maryland or Maryland where we are, has several states that border our immediate borders, and more commonly outside of the state, providing mutual aid, and none of those states have the same parameters relative to establishing those mutual aid guidelines. So state of Virginia's example, the mutual aid agreement has to be signed by the governor. It's a little different than it is here in Maryland. And then emergency medical services, and most of that was designed to look at the SWOT analysis that MIMS and Dr. Alcorta, who is the state medical director, had performed back about a year ago. And I don't think that was ever totally overviewed with the mayor and council, but it was with the Board of County Commissioners, and hopefully you've at least heard of it and maybe even have a copy that is at your disposal to read. So as we move forward, really the goal, it recognized we have a lot of good practices in place, but I think the real critical deduction from this study is going to be that there is a need for long-term planning and a more coordinated approach, meaning maybe between the city and the county, between our officers and the volunteer associations, but collectively, we need to make sure that we all are working in the same direction, on the same page of paper going forward. Again, the one thing I want to highlight, and we talked to the commissioners again, there are going to be things in this document that some of us, even there are things that we don't, meaning our division, do not necessarily agree with, but don't dismiss them as absolute impracticalities, but embrace them as a possibility, and maybe not exactly as it's written or recommended, but some form of that, or at least the discussion relative to that particular topic leads us in a positive direction forward so that we can move this thing in our service in a sustainable environment. And when we talk sustainable, that means the financial side of this as well. It is becoming more and more burdensome on the volunteer departments to sustain their operations. We have a lot of existing funding out there that maybe there are some efficiencies that can be absorbed or encumbered, but we also have a need for additional funding that needs to go. And as that funding goes out to the departments, we have to make sure that there's proper accountability for that, and that we're spending what is taxpayer dollars in the most efficient and effective way. So I'm going to switch out of that document and over into the actual hard document because it's going to allow me to go through the recommendations in total. And you may have already looked at this. There are 28 individual recommendations that are brought forth from the study group. And we'll just go through those numerically, and then I'll give a time for question and answer. Now, what I do want to emphasize is we're going to take today as a presentation of the document and release, and then we're going to take the next 45 days as a review and comment period so that you'll have time to digest and review, and if you have questions, to formulate those. And then our intent would be to have Dr. Genoway come back, hopefully on a day he's feeling better than today, and we'll reschedule these 3 meetings again and have him come back to answer questions and concerns, and we would hope to have that completed no more than 60 days out. I do know it probably wouldn't be till late September just because of internal conflicts of schedules in the same. So moving through the recommendations, the first recommendation that comes through is talks about the inconsistencies noted in the various community rating credits and ISO. More specifically, kind of the easy hanging fruit there is the one that's relative to the dispatch center 911. And this should be page 12, Emily, is where we pick up in the big book if you want to follow. I'll give you a second. Everybody there? Page 12? Okay. So with the ISO rating, what we found pretty quickly that we could not have seen without the study, because as a division, we don't have access to each individual fire department's ISO rating sheet. But with the study, it brought all those together, and we realized pretty quickly, and I think Chief even might have been one of the first ones to point it out, that each department had a slightly different rating in the category for dispatching communications. Well, that really shouldn't be, because everybody, to include the city of Hagerstown, gets their dispatch from the same location, and that's the 911 center that's operated from Washington County, meaning the radios are the same, the phone lines in it are the same, so all of those ratings should have been the same. So that's one of the things we feel like is an easy check that we can come back and catch pretty quickly, is to have them come in and take a look at that. But that's just one example of how that works forward. The procedure for conducting pre-plans and disseminating the appropriate information to responding agencies, we found that there are inconsistencies in how that's conducted throughout the county, and then the ability to access that on the fly or as an incident evolves is even more problematic, because if a local department did the pre-plan and it was only in existence in their own apparatus, that piece of apparatus in today's world may not be the apparatus that's actually on that call. And that would be the same within the city of Hagerstown. If you're on a significant incident, it's not uncommon for us to have even out-of-county units transferred into here. So in the world of technology, one of the things that we should look forward is how can we make that available in a real-time environment. The third, structure a countywide service responsibilities to reorganize efficiency and oversight management. And that's really talking about some of the things that they feel probably should lie within the division and not so much the association, and vice versa. Some of the things the division may be doing that probably are better suited for the association. You know, some of these things we've talked about, they're going to be hard conversations. Doesn't mean they're even going to come forward the way that they're written, but the understanding is that we hired the consultant to look at things and give us input in the way that they see that. To meet the standard of response cover, we're talking about who, what, when, meaning, you know, what do we need to service an area, how quickly do we want it to get there, and how many people do we need to get to make that happen. And I know you've heard that from Chief Lord before, because I've watched a couple presentations where he's spoken to that. The fourth one, to meet the standard response cover, he talks about, let me get this here, standard response, modifying the run cards relative to that, so that when we're looking at the dispatch assignment, that it matches the appropriate apparatus to get it to the standard response. So as an example, in the city of Hagerstown, we're talking about, I think your current one is 16 firefighters in 6 minutes, and he has 18 firefighters in 8 minutes in the recommendation here, if I remember correctly. So, but that's the standard response cover that we're speaking to. One of the things that we've identified in the air unit and rehab unit, and it comes as a recommendation in the study, is a countywide application for membership. There were varying differences in the applications for membership and what they were asking for relative to information and backgrounds and that type of stuff. The study group felt that that was a strong recommendation that should come forward to try to work on a standardized county application for the volunteer services. And that was more in line to make sure that we're complying with federal laws, any IRS regulations, and any of the things that you can't ask on applications going forward. They also suggested that we do background checks on volunteers. What we are currently implementing in the county is there will be background checks on all of our employees, and then I think we're probably going to be doing that with the air unit and the rehab unit, which are the two agencies that work directly underneath either the division or the volunteer association. Sixth recommendation is the funding of all fire EMS agencies in the county is relying on fundraising and undefined, non-increasing revenue streams. And this gets into the hard conversation of how we're going to pay for what we need. And the need is going forward relative to apparatus, stations, and the big ticket items, which are going to be career staff that would need to augment the volunteer and the likewise. And I used a little analogy this morning that 30 years ago I used to work at Carnival, and we sold a hamburger for $1, and we might have sold 1,000 hamburgers that week for the Carnival, so we made $1,000. 20, 30 years later, we increased the cost of that hamburger 100%, but we sold 1,000 hamburgers, and we made $2,000. We're not making a lot of progress on the real inflation that's hitting the emergency services and the cost of doing business today. So the traditional ways that we expect volunteers to pay for things are probably not going to serve us well going forward, and that's going to create a need for a funding model that can sustain that type of expense going forward. And whether that's some kind of fee, whether that's just growing the economy, that's not my job. That is for people that sit in these seats at both agencies here in the county. And but it definitely identifies a need for additional significant increases in revenue that would be coming into the emergency services. One of the things that was identified back in 2009 when we did the EMS master plan, which was an internal county document done by volunteer in the division, it was reiterated in the SWOT study done by MIMS, and is reiterated again in this document, is the need for a single billing provider for EMS to help standardize the billing practices, and it also will help us standardize the billing rates. There are varying degrees of charges that the companies apply based on the transports throughout Washington County. Some are very close, but some are different by a couple $100. And it doesn't sound like much, but when you're talking $800 for this transport and $500 for that transport in another area, it's a pretty different number. And then when we're talking about subsidizing large dollars for salaries and whatnot, we want to make sure that there's some consistency in the billing efforts so that we're getting the same reimbursement for the same service provided throughout Washington County. The pump, this is the 8th recommendation, is one that I'm proud to say we get to put a check on pretty quickly because it's already being completed. It was funded in FY18, refunded again in FY19, is ladder pump and hose testing for the volunteer fire departments throughout the county. We exercised a contract through an RFP last year and saved considerable money throughout the county. There's a couple benefits to that. Not only did we take the financial burden off of the volunteers to pay for that, but we also took the physical burden off because the contract actually states that the company will come in, they'll pick the fire truck up, they'll take it to the test site, they'll offload the hose, test the hose, reload the hose, drive it back, put it in the station, and give the county a copy of the test results. So we take the physical burden off of the fire chief of having to deal with that as well. But the other real benefit is the risk management factor in there. We know that it's done. It's not something that might have slipped through the cracks, not intentionally, but unintentionally. It's done every year. This company keeps track of the records. They keep track of the test schedule. So these are big check marks we can put on the win side of this thing. And a lot of these things you're going to see in here, maybe not a lot, but several, we have actually already been moving forward either prior to or as a result of the preliminary drafts of this study where we saw things that said, you know what, that makes a lot of sense. Let's get working on this now. So we need a process for replacement of fire apparatus. That is something that is currently in process in the county CIP. I think you may have heard something about $800,000 that's coming on board. That first $800,000 came to life in the beginning of FY19 budget, and each year subsequent brings an additional $800,000 on board. That's a program that's designed to try to help absorb some of the debt service that's encumbered by the volunteer companies to keep up with the increasing cost and the reoccurring cost of replacing this larger apparatus. Today, a typical fire truck and engine is going to cost you about $500,000. With a ladder truck, as you're well aware, approaching $1 million or exceeding $1 million, depending on the type of ladder truck that is. These are funds that are not realistic for the volunteers to have to go out and raise on their own without some type of financial assistance with that. Again, that's another check that we get to put in the column, and we'll work on a matrix that actually schedules who, what, when, where as far as replacement schedule for each company. Some of these talk about large vehicles in excess of 35 foot and over 65,000 GVW. We've had some accidents. You just heard a little earlier today. We talked about a loan for the Boonesboro Fire Department that have been encumbered as a result of a rollover and a total loss of that vehicle. So one of the things that they're recommending is we implement vehicle rollover training. And the good side of that is that information and training curricula is available through VIFS, our current insurance provider. So the acquisition of that training program will not cost us anything. It's just the actual implementation and delivery of the program. Same way, the next two are relative to roadways in the county. It talks about the traffic and emergency vehicle movement, and it talks about doing training with the Intersection Accident Prevention Program, again, provided by VFIS. And 1812 brings the same thing when people are responding to the scene in their personal vehicles about safe operation of those en route to a call. The 13th recommendation talks about members that are in multiple agencies and identified hazards, that we should be looking at a standardization of apparatus design to the extent possible, so that if somebody's working in a different station or volunteering in a different station, that there's some similarity to that piece of apparatus from what they may have had in their home station. They also talk about, in recommendation 14, a standard maintenance protocol and contract services for the county. This is one of the things, and I had talked about earlier today, that we don't necessarily think is a reasonable recommendation that we're going to be able to accommodate. And the reason being, it's probably a little easier here in Hagerstown because you're only dealing with about 12, 13 square miles. But if we were to have a single service provider in the county, and let's just say it was here somewhere in the central core, Hancock, Potomac Valley, Smithsburg, some of those outlying companies would have a very difficult time getting here to actually get their vehicle serviced. So that's one of the things where we think is going to be problematic as far as a recommendation. We talk about group purchasing. That actually is a check mark already. And again, I'm not sure, this is one of the things that I wish Dr. Genoway was here for, because I'm not sure what he heard or saw that indicated a recommendation of that should be in here. But the county, and I believe, matter of fact, I know the city does the same for city agencies as well, because we did it at Community Rescue Service. The county already makes available our group purchasing, our contract purchasing, ice melt, toiletries, all those things can be bought through the county as well. And again, the turnout gear program that we just instituted, the volunteer companies are able to tag onto that and exercise cost savings. So that may be something for a question and answer when Dr. Genoway returns. The smoke alarms and carbon monoxide detectors in all fire stations, that is something that they noted throughout that was not necessarily present in everything. It's something that they felt strongly about and made a strong recommendation that we encourage or require both of those health protection systems be implemented, and in many cases they're not expensive. Talks about sprinklers as well, and I know we've had discussions about that throughout the county and the city. The point of capture diesel exhaust systems, a lot of those are available in the federal firefighter assistance grant and can be acquired through that. So that's something that, again, they make a recommendation. Most of this is geared towards personal health and safety, meaning firefighter personal health and safety. The next recommendation talks about inspecting the station's grounds and facilities. This is another one where I can't really delve into why, because I do know, and again, it's based on some of my past history, that the county's risk management office, along with Chesapeake Insurance, comes out annually and inspects the facility. We went through that many times while I was employed at Community Rescue Service. So again, I can't offer the who, what, when, why that's in there, but I'm sure there's something. And then they talk about the 19th within the city of Hagerstown, considering the Hagerstown Fire Department's proposal for station realignment. And again, this is another one I know that's difficult in discussion and not necessarily something we're going to solve here today, but it is included in there, and that would have been something that they would have looked at and evaluated what the Hagerstown Fire Department thought their deployment model might need to look like. The other one, the 20th recommendation, goes down to the Maryland Fire and Rescue Institute. We've had several instances where, because of low enrollments, there have been scheduled classes that have not been able to get started. And MIFRE has a program or a policy that states if you don't have 10 or 12 people in your class registered, they won't start the class. And that's just basically them looking at a return on the investment for the amount of dollars they have to spend. What I can say is we've worked in the last year with the association, and I think they've done a class, we've done 2 classes where we've used some unexpended money to actually subsidize those classes to make sure that they did get off the ground. And we're not looking at every class, we're looking at the core basic classes that someone has to have to be able to ride a fire truck and function safely and effectively on a fire ground, or vice versa on an ambulance if it's an EMS class. One of the things that we've seen throughout the volunteer service, and we've even experienced it in the department that I manage, the Emergency Communications Center, is turnover. And one of the things it would be helpful to know is, why are volunteers leaving us? So what they recommend here is that we implement an exit interview process to find out why our volunteers are leaving us. A lot of times they walk out the door and we're kind of left scratching our head. You know, what happened to Sally? She was around all the time and now she's gone. So I think it's important, if we're going to plan for the future and how we're going to meet the needs of the volunteers, that we understand either what's driving them away or what's not there that allows them to be a continued resource for the community. So that's something that they recommend that we do. We talked about a cafeteria plan, and when we talk about incentives for the volunteers, and what we realize, and even prior to the study, is one size doesn't fit all. In life, throughout life's evolution for each of us, what we find important changes, not our core values, but the things that are more important to us. When I was 20, a house wasn't very important to me, but when I was 23, it was. When I was 27, a kid was important, and vice versa on through that point in life. So when we talk about how do we incentivize volunteers or try to help a volunteer find that extra hour or two to volunteer, we got to figure out what works for that particular volunteer. So it might be something relative to a daycare voucher, but somebody that doesn't have any children, a daycare voucher would be useless to them. But something more in the line of maybe a tax credit or something might be more useful for them. Somebody that doesn't own a house, that's not useful for them. So we need to be, I think, creative in what we look at in this world relative to the incentives for volunteers, and be able to say that we're going to encumber that and try to find a positive way forward. Again, making sure that there's accountability and that we get a return on the investment as well. The get my eyes back here. It talks about developing a plan for the recruitment and retention coordinator and a succession plan. I'm happy to report that's another big check mark in FY19's budget. The county funded to the Volunteer Fire and Rescue Association the salary of the current recruitment and retention coordinator, Nicole Stoudemire. So she'll be remaining on board and working on behalf of the volunteer service in the county and hopefully in the city as well, to help us make sure that we're maximizing our volunteer contributions. We talk about look at some form of regionalization to the standard of response cover and the purchase of assets and protocols and staffing models. And that gets back into looking at, if we could start over, what would it look like? Would it look like 26 or 27 different stations? The city of Hagerstown, would it look like 5 or 6 stations? Would it look like 1? Would it look like 10? So that's something that they didn't really get into the hardcore evaluation of, but they recommend that we have those discussions as leadership groups and try to figure out where we need to go moving forward. They talk about the SOGs, the standard operating guidelines. I can tell you, and Chief and I have had these discussions relative. The Hagerstown Fire Department has a totally separate set of standard operating guidelines than even our department has, than even the other 14 fire departments and or EMS companies. So because we're constantly crossing boundaries every day, it's important that there is some similarity, at least in the core concepts of what they look like. Now, I'm talking about things that we do on the fire ground and those kinds of things. You know, what you do in your station, do you hang your hat on that hook on the right wall, or do you hang it on the left wall? Those types of things, we're not talking about that stuff. We're talking about the operation and the principles and practices of putting fires out and taking care of people. He does mention that the strategic operating guideline used by the city of Hagerstown is something that had value and merit and was something that we might use, if nothing more than a template to start from, but there was definitely value in the document that the Hagerstown Fire Department uses. The last recommendation goes back to the SWOT document. Again, it was formulated by MIMS and delivered, and if you don't have a copy of that, please let me know. We will do our best to come up with a clean copy and get that to you for your review. We have it electronically, so we can certainly and very easily distribute that to you electronically. But when you go through those recommendations, you can see them there. I'm not going to read down through them. We've been into this probably long enough, but overall, really, that's the 28 recommendations that come forward, and I would invite the mayor and council to embark in a review of the document, and as you have questions, you can either forward them through the fire chief, and he can either get them to a county rep that needs to answer that, or the association, but most importantly, when Dr. Genoway returns in the next 30 to 60 days, we'd like him to be able to at least expand upon some of the intimate details of what these recommendations are, and more importantly, why they're written the way they are. And those are the things that he'll need to be here to do. So if you've got any questions of me, I don't know if Dale's got anything to add, or Chief Lohr, and I'm certainly willing to turn the mic over to anybody else. And that's a lot, so.
I have a couple of questions.
Sure.
I'll get to that section.
Is it in the recommendations, Kristen?
It might have been in this thing here.
While Kristen's looking, I would just like to take the opportunity to publicly acknowledge and thank the Board of County Commissioners for including the city in the study. I think that everything that Director Hayes had to say is important, and we do have to row the boat the same direction if we're going to fix fire rescue in the city of Hagerstown and Washington County. I'm committed to that. There are some fussy conversations in our future. I think we've demonstrated that in 3-year tenure that I've been here. This is a step forward, and I will also acknowledge I will be and my staff will be attending the third presentation of this evening with the volunteers in the West End. So I would certainly invite anybody that wants to participate in that from this group to be there. So thank you.
So, I brought this up before, and I brought it up when we had our meeting, our joint meeting with the Board of County Commissioners, and so I get fairly leery about this particular item within the report as it applies to the city of Hagerstown. As I've said before, the taxpayers of the city of Hagerstown put up a little over $9 million a year for a paid city fire department. That amounts to about 18% of our total property taxes as citizens of the city. The next closest group of people in this county contribute about 4% at best of their property taxes to fire and rescue service.
Right.
So we are literally, the citizens of the Hagerstown put up 4 times as much money right now for this particular service than any other group of folks in any other community in the county. And getting to the chief's point of, sort of rowing the boat forward in the same direction as one, in the brief PowerPoint under County Commissioners' next steps to consider, item number 3 is what should the tax be and from what source should it come? And I can only assume that that particular item is referring to some sort of tax that is directly associated with fire and rescue service itself,
I would assume the same.
which automatically brings to my mind that immediate question as a resident, a taxpayer, a council member for the city. How does that affect the city that's already putting up roughly 20% of our property tax for this very service that is largely a paid service, unlike the other portions of that service in the county? And then that goes to recommendation number 1806, which states that the funding of all fire and EMS agencies in the county is reliant on fundraising and undefined, non-increasing revenue streams. It then further states there needs to be a defined and sustainable revenue stream established to provide the infrastructure needs of fire and emergency medical services in both the county, and it emphasizes, and the city of Hagerstown. Now, immediately as a council member for the city, I view this recommendation and then I view this topic number 3, and I view what we do budgetarily already in the city, and then I go back to the one of the top 3, I think it calls it the top 3 goals of the report, which is identified in the very beginning as stating, the desire is to maintain a volunteer system to deliver fire and rescue service as long as possible. And when you review that, and then you go back to, and then you go on to page 19 and 20, which is specific to the City of Hagerstown paid fire system, we are proficient, we're more than proficient in every single one of these measurable categories in our comparable metropolitan areas of cities of 25,000 to 49,999 people. In every single one of these, we are above the metrics of our comparable counterpart cities, except for one, which is the average number of volunteer firefighters, which that average nationwide 6.21 or 6.71, we're at 1.21. And so, you know, I realize that there's going to be a lot of discussion on this. We're going to have to look at this, and that's just my 5-minute review of it. But it does beg that question as we get down that road. Which direction is Washington County headed in? Is it to sustain a volunteer system as long as possible? Is it to create and construct a revenue stream for that purpose and to achieve that in some standardized fashion? And then how do we marry that with the fact that the City of Hagerstown, by all metrics measured, have moved well beyond that into largely a paid fire system? That, in other words, we're not going to go backwards, so to speak. You know, we're going to keep chugging in that direction. And so at some point, that conversation is going to have to conclude with exactly what does that taxable impact mean to an area of this county where it's residents of this county, i.e. the residents of this county that happen to live in the city that are already paying roughly $400 to $500 a year in property taxes for the very service that we're talking about. And so that's...
And I think you're right on all of those points. More specifically in the conversation world, that discussions will have to occur and how all of these things come into being considered. And I'll give you a kind of a little flip to that is, and you covered it, is the City of Hagerstown is predominantly a career service. So it is going to cost the taxpayer more in that area for that service because in anybody's budget, salaries, people, are the most expensive tool. There's no question. And you can see that as we have just brought 8 firefighters on board for $500,000. So if the county gets to that same level of service, I think you'll see that 18% in the county's percentage that they're putting into fire and rescue start to come up and get either very similar in what they look like and what the county taxpayers paying for that.
I'm completely fine with that, as long as that means that the residents of the City of Hagerstown are not included in this idea of a countywide fire tax.
Yeah, I follow what you're saying. Yeah.
We will,
But
I mean,
going back
I think
to-
I'm pretty
Yeah.
complete on that position. You know, our residents are already doing it. They've been doing it for decades, frankly. We're not going to pay a county tax on top of what our city residents are already paying in city tax to achieve a service that this book identifies needs to get to
Right.
over a 6 or 7 or 10-year period, you know, that we frankly sort of already gotten to, you know, 10 or 20 years ago.
Yeah, and those are the discussions that certainly have to come forward by the elected bodies and how that gets addressed and to what degree. That's not something I'm prepared to work through here today or even in the next couple months.
Oh, I understand that.
But it's not something I can disagree with either. But again, I think overall, if you come into this book, and it's a lot of information, it really is, and there's a lot of difficult conversations in this book, and not just in the financial side of it, but the delivery side of it. And if nothing else, my hope would be, and I've said this to the association membership companies before, is one of my goals when I came here was to drag us to a table to have difficult conversations. We might not like them, I might not like them, but I feel like I heard the commissioners fairly clearly when they said they wanted a plan. And our goal was to create that plan, at least a roadmap. And again, you know, as life changes, you might not take the same road. I understand that. but we have to be, I think you said it, we have to be rowing in a very similar direction. And that, I think, is where, Christian, part of your conversation leads to as well. So, and I'll leave it with that if that's okay. But I'm open for conversation, questions. You know, I leave tomorrow for Mako, so I'll be out of town for the next several days. But likewise with Chief, I mean, Dale will be here, and we'll try to get answers to anything prior to Dr. Genoway's return. But more specifically, I encourage you to have those questions and the greater detail ready for when he does come. So, fair enough? Okay.
Anybody else, anything for agenda on the table?
I have a question. Just very high level about number 5. For a countywide application for volunteer memberships should be created, background checks. That doesn't happen now? I mean, it says annual motor vehicle record. I mean, is that, to me,
So the
that should be
I'll
already
let
happening,
Dale
right?
speak to a little bit of this, but I'll start it out if I could. So any driver that is on, any driver in the county, or even be here in the city if they're driving a volunteer-owned apparatus, the county does annual driver checks on them. That's a requirement they have to agree to because the county pays the vehicle insurance. So that part does happen.
Okay.
But the background checks, I think to varying degrees, I can't speak to any, I can speak at least to 3 years ago at Community Rescue Service, we did background checks on everybody. Now, it was an online version, but at least it was an effort to get down a road that we felt we needed to get to. We did them for career staff, we did them for volunteers. But I don't believe that's probably happening throughout the county in whole, and there certainly is not a standardized application throughout the county.
Each company, if they do it, does it themselves.
Yes.
And that, to me, just taking fire out of it and looking at it from a business perspective, you know, insert business ABC here, seems like a very strange way of doing things, even saying, like, without doing exit interviews. I mean, if you don't know who's coming in, who's coming out, and why, and that's like Business 101. So it seems like that would be a simple solution to a lot of who's doing what and why, and there has to be standardized across the board.
100% agree.
And I had to chuckle at the smoke detectors, smoke alarms, and carbon monoxide detectors need to be placed in living quarters of fire stations. That's a pretty funny
I kinda assumed that-
recommendation.
I kind of assumed that was the chuckle, but, yeah.
I would like to assure Mayor and Council that our FM staff, in cooperation with the Hagerstown Police Department, performs a background check on every single city volunteer and career person that comes through the system. That's been in place for quite some time. As you may know, that's caused some pushback when we reject, and otherwise they're not rejected somewhere else. But I want you to have that confidence that we continue to do that, and that's an area of this report where we exceed the minimum recommendation that's already in place.
Thank you.
Anything else? Thank you, Dave. Thank you, Dale.
Thank you.
Chief?
I know it's a little long, but necessary.
Jonathan, I'm sorry, Paul, you're up. Follow up on the rental licensing provisions.
Right. I get that. Not. Thank you.
We have no leg to stand on when it comes to, in the state of Maryland. Property, drug activity.
That they're subsidized. Oh, yeah.
I mean, everybody says, well, I can't be like,
It doesn't give you all the
take the property. Right there it is. That's right.
Doug, the guy that was at Aberdeen that's now in Ocean City.
Okay, guys, let's change gears.
Good afternoon. We're back. You gave us our marching orders at the last meeting in July. We're back to see if our proposed way of addressing it is what you had in mind, or if you think is acceptable. Paul's done a lot of work on this. He's gonna run through this PowerPoint with you. So we brought back the two that you said, yes, if you do those things, you've got the votes. We're also suggesting 4 other things that had previously been discussed that we didn't think there was opposition to, that we've thrown in here to see if you were in favor of those as well. So
Can't keep it simple, okay?
I feel like those 4 were pretty simple. If you say hell no, then we take them out.
I hope this is the thing. Oh, okay. Looks like it's a different clicker. Okay, so the one thing that the main discussion revolved around was the inspection schedule. And it appeared that the last time we got together was discussing the units that have never been inspected, that have been in our program, and the way to address those ones. So we said that, the ones that never been inspected, we would do what's called a safety inspection, which I'll get into in a second here. But it wouldn't be a full interior inspection if they were occupied. If these units that have never been inspected are currently vacant, then we would do a regular rental interior inspection for those. The Section 8 annual inspection would be in lieu of the city safety inspection, so people could still submit those reports. So if they have that, they could submit that to us. And then basically now you would get into that 4-year cycle. Then at your next vacancy, you would have a full interior inspection, and then we go into that it would go into that 4-year cycle then for inspections. So it would just fall right into place like they do now. And then that any new units added into the program, so basically, so that we're not heading down this road 15 years down the road from now, that we're saying, okay, well, we've had 15 years, but we've never inspected these units now. So saying that if you're made a new application to the city for a rental license, that within 30 days, we would do at least at minimum a safety inspection, or we would do a full interior inspection depending on what the occupancy status of that unit was. Because at times people add units to us not knowing they need to be in the program and they're currently occupied. And so it's just to do that inspection so that we know what those units are. The safety inspection that I mentioned, this is something that would be adopted by a policy by mayor and council, kind of easier to amend our policies if need be rather than an actual ordinance on what the items would be for a safety inspection. We would add the definition to the ordinance, but then what are the items that the inspectors would look for while doing this inspection? And the items would be the carbon and smoke alarms. Also, it'd be the ground fault receptacles, electrical hazards, mechanical appliances, the clearance and the maintenance, making sure that they're actually functioning as well. The emergency cutoff switches, water heaters, emergency escapes and means of egress, locks on the entry doors into the place, handrails, guardrails, infestations, and clothes dryer exhaust. Those are ones that are specific codes that I can say these are the items that we can actually inspect to. The unit habitability is kind of hard to identify a specific code for a unit habitability. Like I mentioned the last time we were here, where there was a unit that we did an inspection where there was no drywall on the walls. Well, that same code is the same for a hole in the wall. So kind of hard to say that specific code is something that would be associated with unit habitability. So it would really focus on, the sanitary conditions of that unit. Are there like hoarding situations that are occurring? And then also any unsafe living conditions, such as they don't have a bathroom, kitchen, that type of stuff. It's not saying that, that you have you're missing an insect screen, or, you have a broken window or something along those lines. It's not saying those things are unit habitability. It's just saying things that make it unsafe to live inside that residence.
Can I ask you, you mentioned one thing that got my attention, that was hoarding. Mm-hmm. Now, I've been a tenant, and as long as I was a tenant and didn't call the landlord to fix something or didn't cause problems, I didn't expect my landlord, even if he may have the right to under the lease, to come into my apartment and decide he wants to check it out. So it seems to me that a hoarding issue is an issue that the tenant has caused that I don't have any reason to believe that the landlord independently would have knowledge before somebody notified them of it. So to go in and say, you have a tenant that is hoarding and making this unsafe, we're gonna ding the landlord, that doesn't make a lot of sense to me.
I didn't say we were digging the landlord.
Oh, okay.
I said that we were looking for those conditions.
Oh,
So
oh.
it all depends on who is responsible for those things. A hoarding situation, we always make the tenant, the
Okay,
occupant
I
responsible
wanna
for those
just,
issues.
that's good to hear. I think
You're
everybody,
talking as
Well-
as it applies to unit habitability.
Correct. And with those that we've had in the past, a lot of times we work with the landlord when they
I
find
got
out
it.
that they have a hoarder,
No,
and
I
we'll
was-
work with
I
them to
imagine.
get that
Okay.
resolved.
thank you.
Because hoarding is, usually there's an underlying mental health issue, and I know that, staff will work hard to kind of help. But will you cite the tenant for hoarding when it could be a mental health issue?
We always help everyone to try to get things resolved, to get
Do you
into
help and
compliance.
cite? Do you cite them and help them, or do you?
A notice forces people into compliance, so it gives them a goal to achieve. A lot of times with those types of conditions, they need to know there's an ultimatum for something. So we will work with them and give them a notice, but we will work with them to get compliance.
And if we think that there are outside agencies that might be able to assist the person, we also reach out that way.
Yeah, I definitely know that. I appreciate that.
For me, every one of these items on this list is clear, except that one.
Correct.
So I struggle with how we're going to, how that's gonna be utilized.
The difficulty lies in our part is that, say we do come across an unsanitary, unsafe unit, if I'm saying inspectors limit your vision to these few items, and then we have a
Okay.
police or EMS or fire response to that unit, and it's like, well, code was just in here a week ago and they didn't say anything about it. Now where are we at on something?
Yeah, I get it as it applies to access to confirm that all of these items that are clear here are clearly compliant, but I don't read it that way. I mean, you go into an apartment, let's say that there's a hoarding issue, but let's say all these other things are kosher. They're all, all of those are in order. I'm just trying to figure out, like, what the steps would be or what action staff would take to determine that a hoarding issue has occurred, and we're just using that example. And then what action the tenant has to take. If the tenant takes no action to remove items from the unit, but all of the safety-oriented items are in compliance, what action does the staff take?
It's always hard to answer that, because hoarding situations that I've experienced always have all the safety issues associated with it as well.
I got
They
that,
don't
yeah,
have that. So it's hard to kind of
That
give
likelihood,
you,
I guess, is there.
right.
I think unit habitability is a pretty broad and undefined term when you've defined sort of 12 items above it that say, these are the things we're looking for and these things have to be in order. Like, they're clearly understood.
Like I said, this is a staff recommendation.
I
It's
got- yeah, I
by
hear you.
policy by mayor and council. If you choose for us
The
not to
unit
look for those
habitability is-
things.
It bothers me that it could be too subjective.
I think so too.
Can you further define it then?
Yeah.
That's
Can you
what
go
I'm
in and
thinking.
say hoarding is one, this?
Lack of-
whatever?
Like infestation, to me,
utilities.
infestation's even though that could be a subjective item, that is a clearly understood item. And as a caseworker that worked with children in some of these apartments, seems like forever ago, you know what I mean? That's a clearly sort of attestable, findable.
And I think, you mentioned a word that caused a lot of issues, because when you mention hoarding, the first thing that comes to my mind, that has nothing to do with the landlord or a rental unit. That's the same, if you're telling me that hoarding is in such an unsafe manner that the city can actually do something about it, then you would actually have the same thing in owner occupied. And I'm not saying you don't. The problem is Shelley is correct, hoarding is by definition a mental illness. And, well, I don't know how you deal with that other than through the mental health system, and the mental health system doesn't have anything to offer except involuntary commitments that last literally 48 hours and never longer than that. So it's a difficult situation to overcome, but this is my thought process. My thought process is, I agree that you have delineated what we were really looking at, that, you know, these are issues that if you don't have these, they're ding, you got points and good. Issues of habitability seem to be, we saw this and now it's time to make a decision of talking to the landlord about it and having it taken care of, and if not taken care of, then a ding. But not by definition right off, we don't like this issue that is not so clearly defined, and therefore you're already going to get points, even though we can't clearly define it. But now that, and you know, the example, and I don't mean to kick a dead horse, but I guess I do, is the old strainer issue. You know, you may need that, but that's not the kind of thing we're looking for somebody to get a failure on. It's something we're looking at, hey, we went and saw and you need to replace this. But it wouldn't be something that would cause you to get points or fail on versus the items that you've listed. Unless you can come up with some more real defined things that we can say, well, these things are point accessible because they're clearly something. But they would always, to me, have to be at the fault of the landlord.
What's another example of habitability other than, what else would you, like the hole in the drywall?
Having no water, wouldn't that one unit have no
Well,
water?
like, you know, no water, you know, no bathroom, no kitchen, we come across those, that type of stuff.
Wouldn't no utilities be a major safety issue? I mean, if I'm.
If you wanna list that, like.
Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, I could
no,
list
like-
that,
like
yeah.
absence of operational utilities?
Yeah, that could be
Sounds like a
go
great
right
thing to
into
put
the
on there.
safety issue list. That to me is.
Yeah, I like that.
So take the.
You got no water, sewer,
habitability, but
electric,
define
and you
it.
got a problem.
Yeah, that's your,
Define it.
that's what's happened. You may include that under the different section, but it's defined as something that would be a point getter.
Okay, so let's let's stay on this subject for a second. Let's just say that you come across one of these that we haven't been in yet, and when you talk about unit habitability, that you believe that it's uninhabitable because of the condition of the inside, even though all these other things are fine. Okay, all these other smoke detectors, you have them, carbon monoxide detector, all that stuff. What happens? I mean, if you feel that it's uninhabitable, what happens?
Generally, the items that we listed here are the reasons why they'd be uninhabitable. I mean, that's why we're empowered to interpret the code to determine what habitability is based upon the codes. And it's generally those items, it's not just one item generally
Okay,
that
but
causes
Paul, what
that.
happens? What happens next? What happens now that you have determined it's uninhabitable?
Then you condemn a unit. When an uninhabitable means it's condemned.
Okay,
It's unsafe to occupy that unit.
okay. So now, is there a landlord with you at this point, or one of the property management people or somebody during this inspection?
Yes, that's the only way we would gain access to that unless they said the tenant is going to let you in to do
Okay.
that inspection.
Yeah, I'm done.
I just have another quick question, going back to the schedule. So if units are occupied, it would be the safety inspection. So for the units that have never been inspected but have had a tenant the entire time, are we going to go in those? Or is that something that, I think, at least in my mind, and I don't know about the other four of you, but I was thinking like the units that have had turnover that have just failed to report it to the city, in my mind, that's what's most important. If someone's lived in their home 20 years and they've never left, they're just a renter, but they've lived there for 20 years, I don't necessarily know if that's a unit we should be going in. I think if someone's lived there that long and there's been no tenant turnover, they're happy in their home.
I think the purpose of the ordinance is to ensure the safety of all properties where tenants are renting from, to make sure they're safe with not having an inspection ever done at a property. We do not know those things.
Right,
Yeah, I
that's
guess
why the
when I left
safety-
last time, just me, my thought, and that speaks to this next slide of prioritization, and I mean, they're still in there, but they're not as high on the prioritization. But I think every unit, when we left, the general sense was every unit would be looked at once.
Right.
And then, once it's done, for these safety-oriented items, then it just goes into the rolling schedule so that we don't create an entirely new system.
Right. It would be if that tenant lives there, if we just do that inspection to know what the conditions are, to make sure they're living safely. And then if they live there another 20 years, we would never do another inspection at that time. It would only be when they would leave that unit, we do another inspection.
The way the ordinance is currently.
And I thought when we left last time, we said, we want you to do two things. One, we want to make sure we see every unit at once, because that seems to be something that you keep hitting on. And the other is, we want the nuclear option for
Enforcement.
those units that just, aren't habitable.
How likely is it that, I mean, how many units are there that haven't had any turnover for 15, 20 years? A lot?
I do not know that number. I know that there's approximately 3,000 that we've never been in.
I just can't imagine being a tenant for 15 or 20 years, and then all of a sudden, the city of Hagerstown comes in and does a safety inspection. I understand if there's been turnover and, it hasn't been reported, but I don't know, it just seems like it's very intrusive for someone again, that has been there for a long time, that hasn't used city services, that there's been no complaints, whatever the situation is. It just seems, I just can't imagine that feeling. That would be like me living in my house since 1990 or 2001, and all of a sudden, someone's gonna come into my home when I've never I did call the fire department once.
How do they make that determination to differentiate? In other words, if Paul's saying there's 3,000 units that they've never seen, right? And let's just assume for simplicity, 1,000 of those are currently vacant. That brings you down to 2,000, right? And out of that 2,000, there has to be some assumption through utility review or something that says 1,500 of those, we know that, tenant X wasn't there when we started this program, and so, as you point out, the likelihood is that unit has changed people through the course of this program without reporting occurring. So that takes out, that 1,500. Now you're down to 500, and I'm trying to figure out how staff figures out who that 500 units are. In other words, how does staff then confirm that it's been the same tenant since the inception of the program?
Well, wouldn't the landlord be able to give that?
Oh, yeah, I mean, if that's
information? I don't know.
If that's what we get
Imagine.
down to, and I don't have any problem with that, I just want to make sure that I understand how we reach that number, that magical number. We're going to say that these 752 units, we're not even going to go in because we've been able to confirm through some
means.
Yeah, some verifiable means that tenant X has been tenant X in that unit since
10 years, 15 years, I mean.
What's the limit?
Yeah.
2001, right?
2003 is when the program started.
2003. Yeah,
I mean,
I'm not opposed to it, I'm just trying to make sure that staff then has a clear direction of how they figure that out. And I maybe leave them to the very last and
Yeah.
revisit it.
I'll be honest, it will not be easy.
Yeah, I don't-
It will not
I
be,
don't
because,
understand
how am I
where they're
going to
going with
contact, if that's 500 different properties, let's say it's 150 different owners, I'm going to call 150 owners and say, when was the last time your tenant moved into this place? Because some of these.
So
and
How do you
can I-
get it?
can I prove
prioritize it then? Or-
Exactly, how can I do with those types of things, with that type of qualification, how can I prioritize some?
My suggestion, and first of all, I agree with staff,
That's what, I mean,
because
have
one,
to
you get,
Tennessee, they-
you get down to a couple
You just said
problems.
you can't get that.
One, if the answer is you have to find
So
out
we
from the
can't
landlord,
prioritize it.
Well, we're right back to the issue of we're worried about problem landlords. So you gotta figure that, one, we don't have any ordinance or any law that requires a landlord to notify you of who their tenants are, their names, and how long they've been running. There's no authority for us to do that. So the city calls and says, I want to know who your tenant is and how long they've been there, and the answer you're gonna get is, well, I'm sure you do, thank you. That's one. Two, my idea of prioritizing is very simple. My first priority, we have landlords that have failed. Okay? I don't know if we've been in every one of the units that we have found, and when I say landlords, I am including, and maybe even more specifically, agencies, right? Who actually are the ones who rent these things more than the landlords. The landlords hire somebody to do it, right? So my first priority would be if we have landlords that have not shown a very good success in either, you know, following the rules, that they're the first ones that we're in at, period. Occupied or unoccupied. And actually, the number one people you need to get into are the ones that we've been talking about who have refused to be involved in the program. The very ones that say, hell with it, I'm not being involved, what are you gonna do about it? And our answer is, I guess nothing. Now we have an answer to it. You don't you don't get involved with the program, then you aren't gonna rent. So that would be my priority. And I think the rest of them just come however staff comes out with it, but clearly, and you know, there are certain things you can observe from the outside. To make you think that should be a unit that maybe we'd be more interested in than other units. That's my thought process, because I agree. What about a landlord who is renting and the utilities are in the landlord's name because the utilities are included in the lease? So the only way you could find out is through the landlord.
Is that an I mean, how many, okay.
So
A
for
lot.
this point system,
Yeah,
then,
because
we
what
can't
happens is you
include
turn it off
tenancy
at
length.
the source, right? So if I'm a tenant and I'm responsible for the utilities and I don't pay them for 6 months and leave, that landlord's gonna have to pay those utilities before he can tap in, right?
Kind of, it's outside of our department,
Yeah.
but kind of, yeah.
And typically, the water is in the landlord's name.
Right.
It's the electric, and city electric doesn't cover the entire city.
Right?
So what we're talking about is the prioritization point system. The number one thing you were talking about is prior violations of that property manager, landlord entity, whatever it is that leases that to a tenant.
Both if they're occupied and non-occupied units.
Right.
Right, which obviously include those who refuse to participate in the program, period.
How do you know who they are?
Well, I'm assuming we know it because we've been told the amount that aren't participating. Somebody has to know why. How do we find out?
Well, there's a difference between those who are licensed and don't report tenant turnover and those who are not in the program at all and we don't know where they are. That's something that we're trying to develop strategies to get after, like through a software program.
And, you know, I guess then one of the other issues becomes, because I know what you're talking about, Shelley, and what Emily's talking about. I have a duplex across the street from me. Jeff has been there, I think, 30 years. Okay? You know, I look at that, and I think a knock on that guy's door, seriously, hi, we're from the city, you know, this is, you know, we haven't inspected. You have any complaints? How long you been here? You need to inspect my man, I've been here for 20 years, it's great. Okay, thank you. That doesn't mean it doesn't ever get inspected, but it means maybe we go to another unit next. I don't know, that's very subjective in nature, and I'm not telling you how you do it, but You know, it's the old thing about pornography in the Supreme Court when they said, it's really hard for me to define, man, but I know it when I see it.
What in the world?
To me, there is some similarity when you go to certain rental units and you can look and talk to people and get a good feel real quick whether, well, that is what the Supreme Court said.
okay.
I'm
gonna believe you on that.
That is, yes. No, they were trying to define it.
Yeah.
And they had a lot of trouble. So, again, I think we're all trying collectively to do the same thing, is try to recognize, we're putting priorities on what we want you to do, but maybe another priority of what we don't want you to do is be going into units that have been in total compliance. They need to be last on the list. And so maybe, for instance, maybe we have 6 landlords, for instance, on this part of the list. They have multiple units. On these 6 landlords, we've been in at least 20% of their units, and every one of their units has been perfect. But we haven't been in the other 80%. Well, those 80% to me would get on the bottom of the non-inspected units yet, because we have a history with this particular management agency or this particular landlord. We've gotten a percentage of how many units that we've looked at, and they look fine. But look at these guys. These guys, they have 15 units. We've been in 5 of them, and not one of them have passed. Well, now I want to be in every one of their units. The other ones that we haven't been in at all, I want to put them on the bottom of our priority list. These I want to put on the top. I don't have an answer for you on ones that we've never been in, and they don't have any others, and we don't. But at least that's some thought process of trying to protect the good landlords.
Breaking it down by owner versus property is very challenging, because everyone goes through different LLCs
That's
and
what
they
I was
create
gonna
different
say.
things.
It's very difficult. It's going to require, and I don't know if it's been being done, but obviously a database is the answer that could require ages to put together. And I don't know how other cities that have rental registration deal with what we're really concerned about, and those are the people that don't play at all.
I'll be honest, the other jurisdictions do regularly inspected programs, and every unit's inspected on a regular basis.
But how do they identify what you asked for and I asked for? How do they identify rental units that have never registered?
I've worked with the different jurisdictions, and when I visited those places and come up with a strategy for us to address during this winter, to address those that have never been registered.
Good, that would.
I mean, it generally looks like you have a point system that accomplishes getting to that, except for the exterior conditions being lower. Just hear me out for a second. On the point system, in other words, I think you would accomplish what Lou's saying if you were to double the points for exterior conditions, because that's going to send those units up the scale of that prioritization much more quickly.
And how,
Yeah.
for tenancy length, we just identified, we can't identify that, so how are we putting points to it?
Again, you gotta go with what the data that you have. So you have to go with, I mean, we could debate all day on, well, this owner does this and that owner does that. We just have to go with what we have in our information.
know.
Do people put their electric in their name? Sure. Does everyone? No.
I don't think this is referring, though, to what you're thinking of tenancy, the tenant themselves. This is simply referring to the database that they have of changeover of that particular unit. In other words, it's not referring to the tenant, it's referring to when that last changeover occurred.
No, it's looking at the electric accounts and seeing when the turnovers occur at that property. If a
That's what I
property.
mean.
Okay,
Like, when we
well,
look at
yeah,
that-
it was not our database, or it's the city's database, but not through our department.
But so if they're PE, they
Correct.
wouldn't be included in that?
Correct. Majority of our PE rental properties are larger apartment complexes. There are not many that are individual units.
They're not duplexes, they're single families.
I mean, most of them are our townhomes out at Hager's Crossing is where the majority of
I mean, it
ours
looks to
fall.
me, if you double the exterior conditions, that resolves the question from Lou of prioritization, but then the base question that this body has to be left with is whether you're going to include units that are occupied or not. I mean, that's, you know, and that's, I guess, a philosophical answer
Thought
that
we
each
already
member of the
said-
body
I
have to
thought
give.
we agreed to
Well, I
that.
think that when we left here last time.
That was the direction, that's what
that was-
they built this on.
That was my understanding, but like I said, that's up to each individual
Yeah.
member to decide.
And you can change your mind.
I was fairly clear, for me, it's one time and done. You know, one time, you do the safety stuff, you're done, and you move on, and you don't create this entire other system.
I mean,
and
you
do
have
it
to get
based
in the
on this
occupied ones, that's the whole
prioritization.
point of what we're trying to do.
But if you don't want to, that, I mean, that's,
Well, we, you know, we keep going around and around on this, and at the end of the day, is it not the tenant's responsibility to identify if they're having a problem with the unit that they're renting?
It is, but there's a lot of studies out there that shows that tenants, complaint-based type thing like that is very scareful
Yeah.
of tenants to utilize.
The problem is, you know, we sit here, and for instance, I talked about when I was a tenant, okay? And collectively, my guess is at some stage of our lives, we've all been tenants. That's my guess. And my guess is that those of us who've been tenants have always leased from places that are, you know, pretty nice. Maybe not the best in the world, but, you know, I lived in North Haven, I lived in a lot of places, nice apartments. And I was against this entire rental registration when it was first brought up to us. And John Lestitian said, will you spend a day with me? And I did. We're not out here worried about the people that we're trying to protect, which are, you know, the people living in the quote nice apartment complexes. But what I saw that people were living in at the same rates, by the way, as the apartments you and I were living in, were pure squalor, uninhabitable, disgraceful and disgusting. So why didn't they complain? They had a place to live.
Because that's what they know
Well, no.
and what they can afford.
No. You see, that's the frustrating thing, Shelley. What I saw was not inexpensive. It was the same price that you're paying at nice apartments. What we found, and I repeat it again, that a lot of landlords have income requirements and credit checks. What did we find out about the folks that were living in the hotel? They were
Right.
paying, how much money were they paying?
Crazy amount.
The same amount that they could pay on a mortgage or a very nice apartment. But the fact is, because of their credit history, no landlords in the quote, nice places will rent to them. But the people that are slumlords will at the same price. It's not a matter that they can't afford it. So you expect those people to be calling the city and saying, let me tell you about the squalor I'm living in, so we can throw them out, and they have no place to live? And I might add, for all of those who are so concerned right now about what's going on in our nation, do you really expect that if we have anybody who is here that is, quote, undocumented, that are living in a squalor condition, that they're gonna call the government and say, let me tell you the conditions we're being forced to live in? They're not. And that's why it's so frustrating for us as a group, because we know the landlords in the rental units that we really don't want to go in and bother. Because we know the places, and I use North Haven because I lived there, I'm assuming it's still a nice place, in Hunter Hills, and all these complexes that you look at, and you know they're not going to have a lot of these real basic safety violations, more than likely. But the problem is, the ones that do are the very ones, Austin, that won't call, because they have no place to go if they do. And they have a great fear of retaliation. Whereas if the city is going in on its own, that's a different story. And that's why this whole thing is so frustrating, is to try to figure out who those people are and where those places are that really require the inspection. And that's why I keep insisting that, and maybe if we can let these landlords and tenants know that it would come into their units, you know, I would be much happier to do a great relaxation on landlords that are passing and say, geez, we won't be back in there for quite a while. Because a lot of these places we wouldn't have to, but that's, I don't know how else you avoid it.
Yeah,
though.
so it seems then that maybe, is to Kristen's point, if we put, in this point system, if we put a lot more weight on the exterior conditions, that will probably point us toward
I agree.
the property that is probably that way on the inside too.
I would agree. And if nothing else, it'll help clean up the exteriors of places. But that's our problem. Yeah, it was one thing, Shelley, when I thought at least it was because of finances, that's all they could afford. It was like, well, at least there's something. When I found out what they were paying for rent, it was like, you gotta be kidding me. These are just people that are being abused. And that's why we have so many frustrated landlords that come in here, because they're not doing that. They're not doing it. And you know, we know some of them. And the other thing I would say on these properties, when we talk about how intrusive it is, well, I sure hope it isn't. You know, people should not expect that we would be doing anything essentially more than what our fire department does when they come knocking on doors and saying, would you let us in to check out your smoke detectors? I see your safety things here. They're pretty straightforward and clear. I would assume, I would like to assume, for instance, that we don't necessarily have to check every single outlet in an apartment. If we come in and it's pretty clear that this apartment has the electrical upgrades that are necessary. I would like to think that we're not opening up closet doors, but that we're looking for these safety violations essentially. And I would like to think that it should be pretty clear to an inspector when walking into an apartment whether that thing is in compliance or not. I would like to think on these major apartment complexes, for instance. I can't imagine that all of the units aren't up to snuff on the electrical outlets. I mean, can we imagine any of the major apartment complexes that if we checked 4 of 30 units in one complex, that we would have to think that we would have to check every electrical outlet and every one to think that they don't have the proper grounding. These are the kinds of thoughts I have when you talk about being intrusive. I would like to think that we don't have to be, that you can walk into a place and go, I can see this place is going to be okay. And the only other condition I'm thinking about safety issues, when you say dryer vent, can you delineate on that?
Make sure it's going to the outside and it's of the proper material. A lot of
Okay.
times people buy the vinyl ones.
Versus being
and stuff.
cloth.
We would not know.
Well, when I see dryer vent, I don't know. Okay,
Yeah,
so
yeah, it's
that's
proper
fine.
material, that
That's
type of
fine.
stuff, proper length.
Right,
Those
gotcha,
types of things, not creating a hazard.
Gotcha.
Can I ask something of the 5 of us and the mayor and the city council, like right this second? Can we please schedule a goal-setting session, like right now, like an all-day goal-setting session? And here's why I say that at this exact time. We are asking you to hit a moving target. I'm sure you're frustrated with us. I'm frustrated with us. I'm frustrated with myself. We have asked you to take this back like 10 different times, and every time you come back, we're telling you something a little bit different because we have more conversation around it. And at this point, I think it is on us to come up with a clear defined as this body, now halfway through this administration, what we would like the goal of your department to be for the next 2 years in regards to this program, in regard with the changes that the Picker Committee made, and then with everything else, what we would like the goal of Parks and Rec to be, what we would like the goal of our marketing strategy, all that. I think it is important that we do that, because we are a little all over the place, because we have these conversations, and then we come back and we have another conversation, but then we bring up more points, and you bring up more ideas, and then I just think we need strategic goals as to what we expect and what we would like to see happen with this program, instead of going, hey, Paul, can you make change X, Y, and Z and come back again? And then we have more conversations that, you know what I mean? I just think we as a body need to define with the rental registration program, with all these changes, like what our vision is and how we would like it to be carried out, instead of piecing it together in bits and pieces. And that's what I feel like we're doing right now.
Well,
And I don't think that's fair to do to you guys.
and I concur, we've asked for, I'll never forget, when Austin was appointed, that was one of the first conversations that we had, was to set goals, and I know that it's been talked about in budgets and seasons and all that kind of stuff, but it's now August.
When do we do it?
7 months.
I mean,
I'm there.
I think we should take a day or 2 days, or like we had done a while back, and come up with an agenda of each, you know, all the big ticket items right now that we're working on as a city to see. I just think it needs to be clearly defined.
I agree.
No, no pushback here.
Well, we'll pick a day.
And you work out of town, so when's good for you?
Can we do it on a weekday, or do we have to do it on a Saturday?
I mean, I don't care about whatever you decide on that day. I'm trying to figure out at this very moment, is that suggesting that we're setting this aside?
I just thought it was an appropriate time to bring it up, since we're
Okay.
talking.
I think it's a good thing.
Sorry,
But-
I know that was off track, but we're sitting here having debates again about something that
But
was
I feel
clear,
like-
but it's not clear, it was clear, but now it's not clear, and
But I feel like that's the purpose of these work sessions, is we sit and we have a discussion with staff to get to resolution of items
Right.
so that they're brought to us in some formal, final manner to implement. And I get the goal thing, I
Right,
just,
'cause
I just want
this-
to make sure that this isn't, that the suggestion here isn't that we're going to now set this aside.
and we can finish the
For-
conversation. I
okay.
just, you know, do we have a goal as far as this program? How we would like to improve it, what we would like to see improved, how, you know,
Well,
what
I
we think we
make
can do
that
better?
clear. I think we want to see every unit inspected. I think we want to see a priority system, and I think staff is reacting to it appropriately. What we're getting back into, Emily, is the crucial question, I think that you and Shelley are bringing up, and the mayor has been interested in too, is whether you inspect occupied units. So I think that, you know, if that's something the body still hasn't really come to a good conclusion on, something to continue to discuss, but I think clearly, my guess is staff has got enough work to do, that if we told them we didn't want them to deal with occupied units until we came up to a decision on how to do them or prioritize them, that would be very doable to do. I'm assuming you have plenty of units that are unoccupied that you can inspect or not.
I tend to switch over to the vacant structures program.
Well, it just depends on the direction that the council wants to go on these types of things, because there's many discussions on the units that these places are horrible. Well, if they're not calling us for inspections and they're occupied, how do we know?
Right.
This is a terrible condition. How do we allow someone to live in this type of place? If we're not doing the inspection of that place, how do we know? So
And the issue is, if all we're doing is waiting for units, we get right back into this circle problem. If we wait for units to become unoccupied, then we're right back to saying we're relying on the landlord. And that gets us right back to the fact that the problem units are gonna be landlords that are not gonna tell us that they have a tenant turnover.
In perpetuity.
Which means we're not gonna be in those units again, which means the only units we're gonna be in are the units that are in compliance.
But if
And
we-
then what good does that do us? That gets us right back where we started.
If we know there was tenant turnover, that if you can tell, then going forward, shouldn't they, when there's tenant turnover, shouldn't that be when we're inspecting them? Shouldn't that just be enforced?
Yeah,
Well,
but
how
they're
can you
making
tell?
they're making a significant assumption based on utility billing.
Yeah.
Utility billing can
Okay.
switch, I mean, I have, and I'll use this example, you know, in Myersville, from time to time, individuals come in and say, hey, I want the utility in my name now. You know, I'm paying the bills, and whether, let's say it's for an aged parent, or, you know, a sibling, you know, or a son or daughter. I mean, that happens on a fairly regular basis, and it could happen, you know, a number of times without an individual ever changing. Staff simply making an assumption.
Yeah, and the staff
Of any
says the
number of
water,
those units
water bills are usually in the
may
name of the
have or may
landlord,
not
and-
have changed.
And the electric could be PE, which means we don't see it. And I will tell you right now, if I'm a problem landlord that does not want to comply with this program, and I know the way we are finding out tenant turnovers is by way of utility bills, I guarantee you that utility bill is gonna be in my name. In addition to that, those are the type of landlords that you would expect a fair amount of tenant turnover, who may very well stiff the landlord for utilities if that's in the lease. So again, you get right back to the fact that we miss the ones that are smart enough to say, I'm not gonna be involved in the program, and I'm gonna make sure the city can't independently, outside of me notifying them, know that there's been a tenant turnover.
And for me, I mean, you're right, we've been talking about this for, you know, a year now, and I'm just gonna be very blunt about where I think we're at. I see folks from the Landlords Association in the room, and I've spoken with them, I've listened to them. We obviously had a ton of folks in here that made comments that said, please, 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 don't invent an entire additional structure of city bureaucracy to weigh down upon us when we're already doing what we're supposed to be doing. And we came back to this table and we said, we hear you folks loud and clear. Staff, we're telling you now, we don't want you to do that. And at the same time, we hear from our staff that say, look, we have some issues, some unresolved issues from a program we've had in for an extensive period of time that we need addressed. And we said, okay, but we don't want you creating another weight of bureaucracy over everybody to accomplish addressing the issues that you've identified. And we pulled those 2 points out that were fairly repetitive. We said, okay, if that's your concern, then let's address the concern. Let's not create something entirely new to maybe address the concern that has that detrimental impact to the folks that we heard from. And we've gotten as far down the line, in my opinion, as we can basically get to say, you know what, we know these are out here. There is more than probable cause that changeover has occurred. And we're just going to assess those, and not even on a level of full inspection. We've even watered it down further to say, we're just gonna do a basic safety inspection. And I feel, you know, I'm speaking a little bit to the landlord folks that are here and his staff the same. I guess as a council member, I feel like I have compromised as far as I can possibly compromise to satisfy two clearly opposing positions with as little impact, you know, to the folks affected as possible, and at the same time capture and reduce those incidents that we know are occurring of noncompliance. So I think we're at that point where we either, you know, move forward with this compromise, or we just look at staff and say, just keep doing what you're doing. Because philosophically, I don't think that there's any further movement, you know what I mean, in one direction that, or other that you can go to accomplish the task. I just don't, I don't see any other way of doing it, except to just keep running the program and wait as we wait, which then, you know, every 1 or 2 years brings up the issue, and then, you know, some other form of body or, you know, this body is sitting here again, we hear you, we see those issues, we're getting complaints about those items, any way we can beef up the program to address them. You know what I mean? And then we don't because, you know, we don't want to go in this direction of saying, okay, you know, now we're short. I don't know how much further down we can take it.
That was a lot of words.
Let's keep going through the, through your presentation, Paul, will you please? Because we kind of like stopped and jumped from here to,
I guess I'll just make sure, is that where we want to head as a group here? Because I don't know if that's where we're going. I don't want to waste everyone's time.
No, I don't think you can go any further.
If we're not going to discuss anything
If
and
we
we're
don't
not
have a
going to move
majority,
forward.
if we don't have a majority in favor of doing this compromise, and a majority meaning including the absence of being overturned when we go to adopt it, looking at the mayor, then I agree. I don't think staff
I'm
can go
agreeable
any
with
further.
Kristen. I think what you've put together is responsive to what we've asked for. And the only thing I hear that is a real hang-up here is the inspection of occupied properties. And if someone can tell me how we can effectively have this program work with exempting that, I'm more than happy to hear it. But it seems to me if we exempt occupied properties, then we're just not changing anything at all. We're just continuing down the road of we'll go to where landlords who are in compliance notify us of.
And can you include occupied properties that you know are in violation, that have whatever that definition is? You know, that you know have had tenant turnover and they didn't call it in or something like that.
I think that's where I'm at, and I don't know how to make that work, and
Yeah, I
that's
don't
why I'm
either.
being quiet right now, because the wheels are turning. But I feel like if someone has lived in that house the entire time that we've had this program, there's a reason why we haven't been in it, because they've lived there, it's their home.
And that's why I think
And I
if
don't
you
think-
beef those two up, it puts them at the lowest level in the price. In other words, they're getting it last. In other words, if you look at staff's
Or how
point
about never?
system,
But they're still getting it.
that never is a basic stance. In other words, if it's never, then it's never. And I think staff's being very clear that they don't have the ability to give you a response of never, because they don't have the ability to say it hasn't occurred. They don't have the
Never,
ability to check for that.
While we can be relatively sure that that tenant has lived there for X amount of years, however we want to define that, that until there's a turnover in that property, because that responsible landlord is probably going to tell us.
How do you know that that's the case? When you say that responsible landlord's gonna tell you, I say the irresponsible landlord's gonna tell you, oh, I've got a tenant who's been there 15 years, and I would tell you that the irresponsible landlords, and even some of the responsible ones who are sick and tired of governmental intervention, when you call and say, I wanna know on this property how long your tenant has been there, and especially property managers or somebody who's renting 7 units, I want to know for each one of your units, how long has a person been there? And I don't know if you're going to ask them who, but they have no obligation to tell you that. They have no obligation to tell you that. So they just don't tell you. And they say, what do you want now from me? You already got me in this program, now you're demanding me to tell you how long my tenant's been there. And again, I think the majority won't respond. And the ones that don't want us to know are gonna say, they've been there forever.
So on the prioritization matrix here, then tenancy length is something that's just a moot point. It means
If we could
nothing.
establish, if somebody can come up with a methodology to establish that my neighbor across the street shouldn't have to have his place gotten into, I'm all for it. I'm all for it, and the best I can come up with so far is to look at places that we've inspected, and we say, well, geez, this particular landlord, this particular management company has a history in the past of having very passable units. We don't have to prioritize them on the priority list, that's all I'm saying. We have, again, when we told how many units we haven't been in, and then you start looking at a priority list, I don't know how else to do it.
Have you printed out these 24%? Like, you know all the addresses of the 24%?
It's going to take manual work at that point. I can only go so far with a computer, but I've got a rough number of where I'm at.
One of the things that you brought up a couple of times is that some of the locations and municipalities that you've gone to have had yearly inspections, interior, exterior, all that kind of stuff. How long have those programs been in place? Earlier than 2003 when this was implemented, or later?
Some early, some after. Some have been in place for 50 years, some only been in place for 10 years.
Okay.
We're the only jurisdiction that I can tell that does the inspection program this way in the nation.
In the nation?
Yes. That does it at a tenant turnover.
It was a compromise of the Landlords Association when it was first created, in order to get a program to pass with the mayor and council.
And yet we haven't been in 30% of them. In 15
That's how
years.
the program works.
Because it's a tenant turnover, or reported tenant turnover.
I just-
And we're back again
and
in
I-
that same circle where we don't know whether they're involved in the landlord registration program or not, because they may never have registered.
Which is why I like your point.
And they
matrix
keep their,
that moves those
utilities
ones
in their own names.
violations, those ones with low unit reporting, up to the top of that list. Because you know what, those are the ones.
what are exterior conditions that would, let's go to that for a minute, because that seems to be a theme of addressing the
The
interior.
exterior conditions on that was based on annual rental exterior inspections that we did at the properties. So it's something that we do if you're registered in the program, and these are the ones that we know are registered in. It would be what number of violations you have in your annual exterior inspection
On a 4-year.
Does that,
on a 4-year average.
does a violation include grass in the sidewalk?
Mm-hmm.
One of the things that we had talked about before was an incentive program. These points, this is new, right? I just want to be clear.
We were asked at the last council meeting to determine good versus bad
Right.
landlords. I have no way of doing that other than by creating some sort of point system
No, I like
to award
that.
those. So that is the prioritization. But again, with any type of incentive program, I cannot sit here and say that an incentive program could work because I don't know what the conditions are of 3,000 units in our town.
But we could start. So we could start, like, when you do these in what?
Only if we get into them, yeah.
Or whatever right, but based on the point system, so if you increase the amount, like you're saying, which moves the priority down to the ones that I'm concerned about, and then maybe there's an incentive for a reduction in the fee, or I'm just talking out loud, but.
Its fees are paid for our operations.
Right. The fees that we charge.
Well, what I'm
pay for our
saying is if you're
operations.
higher on the priority list, then you pay a higher fee.
That, again, that's a tiered system, and again, these are units that we've never inspected, so I cannot say that a unit that has horrible conditions on the inside, but we've never done any inspections, they would be lower on that scale because the landlord keeps the electric in their name, so they would have a low scale on that. There's no way to give any type of incentive program until we actually inspect every unit in town. I can't,
And then
because I don't know what the conditions
And then know
are.
whether, if we have a tiered fee system, whether it would cover our costs. Because at that point, we know the condition of everything.
Just trying to make it work for everybody.
Oh, we go back to, You know, we've got this other collection of properties out there that are rental units that are not registered and have never been registered. They're just operating under the radar. So does the landlord association know who those units are? I mean,
Somebody should know.
Just on a day in, day out basis, in the course of managing their properties and roaming around and doing their due diligence, do they know where the problems are? And can we enlist their help to identify where we need to go in and make sure that a unit that's not registered and is rented is dealt with?
And what is the punishment again? Is there a punishment? Is there like a,
It's a municipal infraction of fine.
yeah, fine, okay. But we don't know where all of them are.
We
But
don't
not
know
at
where
this
any
point.
of them are, or else we would already be issued with the fine.
We're working on that, like I said, I saw
Yeah.
what other jurisdictions did to try to identify those particular
I
units.
mean,
in some limit.
we're making the landlords, the good landlords, the Landlords Association conform to our rules, and they're doing their due diligence to try to do so. And can we enlist their help to try to ferret out the bad?
And I think,
The bad ones.
you know, I think it's important to note within staff's structuring of their prioritization, the tenancy length, I think addresses some of that concern that you have of an individual. So the longer an individual is there, the less points it's gonna bring up on that system. So that means that, you know, if you just take, you know, a landlord's property, and let's say they got 6 units, and let's say that, you know, 5 of the 6 have been inspected in the period, you know, of consideration, so they get 1 point for that, and, you know, of that one, that person's been there 4+ years, they only get 1 point for that one. You know what I mean? It dramatically drops, so I guess I see that as an incentive of addressing that question of lowering that particular unit on the prioritization scale.
But we can't use length, tenancy length.
Because we don't know.
Yeah, but he's using that based on that inspection and.
And it's on electric accounts.
Yeah,
is all
and
we
your
would base
utility
that on.
schedule.
So there's going to be flaws in anything because we don't have the details of everything. So we could debate all of those particular items all night long, essentially. So we have to go with what the data that we have to try to determine a prioritization.
And I guess that's my point. If the data shows that Emily Keller has lived in this rental property for 16 years,
Then you're way
then
down the list.
that shows that it's been occupied, that's why it's never been called for an inspection. It would work both ways.
Potentially, like I said, I'm
'Cause I just-
running numbers out of a computer, and
Right.
it takes a manual person to look at all of them. It takes a person to look at everything manually to get you a finite list on everything.
Yeah, I don't envy you at all. I just think we keep saying bad landlords, bad landlords, bad landlords. You know, we want to go in these because it's a potential bad landlord situation, but if someone has lived there the whole time, there's a legitimate reason why we have not been called for an inspection. That doesn't make them a bad landlord. It just makes it as occupied for the entire length of this program. So if we can use tenancy length by looking at utility bills, but we can see that I've lived there that whole time, or, you know, person X has lived there that whole time, I don't think that that's something we should be, they have a legitimate reason why we haven't been called for an inspection, right?
I mean, I feel like that's an assumption. Like, we're looking at something and saying, yeah, everything's perfect. Based on simply a name, and that name could just be the name. In other words,
But the name is an indication that they've been there the whole time.
it's an assumption that individual.
Not all times, because it could be just in the landlord's name, but it goes to that address.
I'll give you an example. The older gentleman that lives down the street from me, the utility bill is still in his father's name. I don't mean to call him out. But his father's been dead for
Don't go
30
there.
years. You know
Matter
what
of
I mean?
fact, I think.
So,
I'm
you're
not
making an
so sure that
assumption
my,
that.
I'm not so sure my utility bill still is in my father's name. He's been dead for 20 years.
Yeah.
think it
All we
is,
can
matter
do
of
is the
fact,
best
'cause
that we can
never had a
do.
reason to change it.
Okay.
But if we're using assumptions to support the program, then shouldn't we also use assumptions to support the possibility that that person has lived there for the entire length of the program? I mean, we're using assumptions all the way around. We just came to that conclusion because we're using it in this category and this.
No,
I don't know how
you know the number of units that have been inspected in a particular property. You know the number of violations that have occurred. Those are two measurable areas that staff can clearly measure. I would say that category 2 is the only subjective category. And I feel like staff's throwing that in to address council's concern, which was part of the landlord's concern of trying to push down as far as possible on the priority list those that have longevity or potential longevity of tenancy. They're trying to push them as far down the prioritization list that they possibly can by using that subjective criteria in the other two measurable criteria. Like an incentive to that, you know.
So what do we want to do? Do we want, we want rentals to be registered. We want to make sure at rental turnover that the tenant coming in is getting an inhabitable, safe place to live. Those are our two big goals, aren't they?
Yeah.
And what is your goal? What do you,
We want to make sure everyone has a safe place to live in the city of Hagerstown.
okay. Just wanted to hear that.
So if the person's lived there for 20 years and they haven't decided to exit the place, I assume they're happy with it.
Just like Kristen said, though, you don't know if that's the person that's
You
lived
knock
there
on
for
their
20
door.
years.
You gotta knock on their door.
Okay,
It's kind of a
so
program
I have
to do that.
so that, your thought process. So how far do we push the issue? So if you call my landlord, if I had a landlord and said, you know, Emily's lived in that house for 20 years, but we want to inspect it, and they call me and I say, not a chance. Not a chance, they're coming in my home, it's fine. Are we going to push the issue?
That would be a discretion of this council to decide.
How long have you lived
'Cause I
there,
think
did you
if-
say? What was your example? How long did you say?
I just think if someone if someone has lived there the entire time, that's why it hasn't been inspected. We've established that they've lived there, that's why there hasn't been an inspection, because there's been no tenant turnover, and they are happy with their,
Which
I don't
doesn't
know how-
cover like the safe and habitable and
Right.
all those things.
So then going back to my prior point of to identify those units that are not part of the rental registration program and are not potentially safe, can we enlist the landlords association's help in determining where those units are so that then we can go and find out if they are being rented?
Yeah, I'm not, I mean, that sounds good in theory, but I'm not interested in enlisting the help of the landlords association to sort of rat out, you know,
Well,
other property owners. That sounds,
it seems to me it would be in their interest, I don't know.
well,
That presumes that they support the program.
yeah, I'm
Their
not gonna support
competition is
that.
operating under the radar and not subject to the same registration fees and the same inspection hassles and everything else that they are.
I'd rather give staff some perspective, as you point out, and I think that seems to be, you know, your concern, that the landlord is perfectly fine to provide verification, and you move on. And I know that takes the level of compromise down even one more step for me, but if there's verification, I'm fine with that.
And maybe there's something that they can.
Somebody
I don't
says,
know,
yeah, I've been
maybe-
here 17 years, here's my record to show that.
Here's my
Boom.
lease, here's the, I don't
think
know,
that's what
something.
that's
Okay, well,
like
if you
what
can
I
get
didn't,
that-
I didn't just mean, you know, call me up and be like, oh, no, they've been there 15
No,
years.
no,
I mean,
no.
what if they have a signed lease with Emily Keller since 1998 or
If a landlord wants to
whatever,
provide that
and that's the same-
verification to code, and that's the case, I'm okay with that.
But
Because I think that speaks to the issue that then it gets back to, we're trying to catch who we're trying to catch.
But to Lou's point, though, they don't have any legal obligation to provide that information.
No, but I
They don't, but if they want to.
But I can tell you who would be the person to provide that information.
The ones you're trying to catch.
The tenant. Tenant.
By going and knocking on the door.
Or a phone call, because the landlord, A, may not respond for various reasons. Some of them could be just impossible to get a hold of. However, what we're so concerned about right now is invasion of privacy. It's not the landlord's privacy that we're invading, right? That's not what you're concerned with. You're concerned with the tenant, okay? So the tenant is the one who has an incentive
Right.
to say to you, hey, I've been here for 20 years, I got no problem. I've been here for 5 years, this place is great. You know, again, what we're asking, I'd like to try to give staff the credit, hopefully if we can get some directives to be able to understand it and implement it. Some of the things you ask to be implemented, when I say you, I mean we collectively, can't just be put down in black and white. And that's an example that I give. You call my neighbor across the street and say, you know, City of Hagerstown, we're going over all this stuff, we need to get our things in order, and can you just give me an idea how long you've been living there, because we have certain places that we have to inspect, certain places that we don't have to inspect. And do you have any problems with your place? I mean, that can be done instead of people having to go out on the road all the time. It can be done with phone calls. I'm saying a lot of people may be working, but I think we all collectively agree that we would like to exempt those people if staff can identify them. Staff can identify them by simply looking at a computer screen or any other methodology, but I don't have a problem if these people are scheduled for the inspection and staff comes out and verifies from the tenant themselves. I got no problem, everything's wonderful, and I've been here for 15, 20 years. That's not a tenant I'm too worried about.
For me, it's gotta be the duration of the program.
But that, I don't care.
Which is 15 years.
Right, I mean, otherwise it
That's
doesn't
fine.
work.
15
That's
years
fine.
seems
Yeah, because
quite reasonable.
I have no
Otherwise, it
problem.
doesn't support the point that we're trying to accomplish, which is address each of the units that haven't been addressed since the inception of the program.
And Lou brings up another question, the communication of going to these houses. I mean, we're not gonna be able to find people's phone numbers, or some of them. They're the phone book. My phone number is not listed in a phone book.
They still make phone books?
I don't know.
would-
I hear they
would prefer
do.
that we're dealing with the property owner than the tenants.
It's the property owner, it's the license holder of the property.
So when you communicate, like your version of communication, I know like a long time ago, there were postcards mailed out. I understand that that's a little cost prohibitive now, but that there used to be reminders that were sent. Is there an electronic way that we are doing that to make sure that, you know, that the property owners know that there's an inspection coming up, or that, you know, hey, something that gives an indication?
We're kind of going on different paths again here on different things here and stuff. As far as the communication efforts, as far as what this would relate to as a non-inspected, of what our vision would be, is sending a letter. We would have our prioritization based upon the points on whatever that may be. We would send a letter to the landlord saying that you need to schedule an inspection with our office in the next 30 days for these particular units at your property. And then they would call us and schedule the inspection. If modifying that is that we go out to the place and we say that that tenant's been there for 15 years and they don't want to have an inspection, that's perfectly fine.
Why can't you just say in that letter, let's say you're gonna send Mr. Smith, a letter to that effect. These 17 properties are scheduled for inspection, you know, per the directive of the code, because they have been identified within the program as, you know, not receiving any prior inspection for the duration of the program. You know, if any of these units have been occupied for the entirety of this time, please provide verification within 60 days, you know, that's the case. Like, I don't see it any more complicated than that. And then landlord X, Mr. Smith says, you know, hey, you know, here's six verifications or whatever, you know, or they're not going to. And if they're not going to,
then that should send up an immediate red flag that we should go.
Yeah, we're giving
do
them
that.
the opportunity
Right,
to
but
say,
I think it should be that cut and dry. You get 60 days to provide verification, after that letter. And that thing of you guys calling and knocking and chasing down, I think is going to be a
It's a-
nightmare. I think you put the impetus on the property owner, which you're instituting the program for, to say, hey, I'm so glad you're shaking your head back there to say, I can provide that within 60 days, no problem. I am sure that every responsible landlord out there has records to that effect and can provide that for the tenant that they want to say to you, look, Mrs. Jones has been here for 17 years, there's no reason to come to this unit.
So
And
at
those
that
that
point,
are
do
in the
they
Section
drop
8
out?
program can send their verification saying.
Those in
"I know
Section 8,
haven't
you
been in
know,
our unit,
yep.
But we've been inspected every year.
If your unit is
We're
subject,
in the program."
if your unit is within Section 8, please provide verification within 60 days that it has received, it's whatever Section 8 inspection, in the last X, and that unit's done. That unit's off the list. And then those are two types of units right there that you're never even going to go in because that responsible landlord has provided you those pieces of documentation that allow you just to move on.
Correct,
Okay.
that's where I was
So
talking
that-
about and stuff
So that drops
there.
out then, if they show, provide the
That's
verification
right.
within 60
Yes.
days, okay.
And then and let's be real honest, because I think this is sort of like a free pass moment.
Oh, yeah, this is a.
So for every landlord out there that didn't do something right, I don't care whether it's 8 years ago or 12 years ago, we shouldn't ding them right out of the gate and say, oh, well, out of these 17 units, you can only verify 11 of them. We shouldn't go, oh, well, we're gonna ding you for the other 6. We should just say, look, these other 6 are the opportunity to come clean. We're gonna come in, we're gonna make these basic safety inspections. We're gonna ignore the fact that you didn't do a tenant turnover 11 years ago, or
That's
7
not-
years ago, or
that's not the
whenever.
purpose.
Right.
And then we inspect them that one time for those safety measures and we move on.
That's the whole purpose
I mean,
of what we
I
were
think
here
it
for.
can
well, I
be
mean,
that
that's,
simple.
yeah, that sounds that sounds fair.
Reasonable.
Yeah. Although, a letter, though, today at my house, I got a letter that was dated August 9th to let me know that paving was gonna start the week of August 13th. Today's the 14th, tomorrow's the 15th, so, and that was delivered to my door for something that should have, do you see what I mean? So a letter, if there's like an electronic,
We only have
No,
60% of
60
people
days.
only have emails in our system.
So
So
just
we
do a
have an
certified
address
letter.
for everyone.
or both, can you do both?
And 60 days
No.
is a substantial time period.
I wish we had a
if it ta-
computer
if it
system that
takes a
could do
week-
the things that
Oh,
you are requesting.
I'm sorry, I'm sorry.
If it takes a week
Okay.
to get there, they
Keep in
still
mind,
have.
the last page talks about implementing this July of 19.
Correct.
So not only do they get 60 days, they have,
A year.
Everybody's gone almost a year to say, whoa, I think I missed these 3 at some point in the
right,
past.
can we get these done real
Need to
quick?
go
Can I
get
just
them.
jump these in and avoid this whole rigmarole that I know is coming
Yeah.
10 months from now? I think that's completely reasonable.
And again, we're talking about the prioritization. This is a policy. This is not in the
I
ordinance
would only suggest
itself.
one thing. I would suggest on the point system or whatever we tend to use from then on out, that we take grass on the sidewalk out of the exterior inspection.
Thank you. Thank
I
you.
mean,
I think our inspectors have better things to do.
But I mean, the grass on the sidewalk counts as a violation
I-
toward the point system, and I'm just,
Because I don't have sidewalk.
Yeah,
you don't have a sidewalk.
I don't.
Well, we haven't made you put one in yet.
You have to ask the state.
We should.
That's their 15 feet.
what I see growing between the street.
Probably have a
and
fence in
the
your front
curb,
yard, too.
No, yeah. I'd like to see that removed.
We do get complaints about that one if it's not dealt with.
Oh,
They get
wait,
gravel
don't get me
complaints.
wrong.
Yeah.
If someone has weeds this high growing in their sidewalk, they need to be told about it. I mean, that's all there is to it,
No,
there's
But
no
if
definition
someone
of
has,
height.
if someone has that little bit of stuff that's just growing
Well,
along
can I
the
just make
curb,
sure, between the curb and the street is the city's responsibility?
100%.
Please, I have weeds across the street from me, literally this high between the street and the curb. And that's my concern, is I see it all through the city, and I just have real problems seeing.
Someone sent some pictures to that.
There's
I
very
will take
thick
pictures.
vegetation this summer. It's been hard to keep up with.
Oh, it's been terrible.
Speaking of that,
You're gonna mow?
no. Street.
But that has to be something that the council decides if they want to.
Okay, so just to recap on our
Remove.
prioritization discussion that we had. Essentially, the thing is stating that we are going to have them do some sort of verification that they've had the same tenant since the beginning of the program. And if they have something verification of that nature, or if they have some sort of Section 8, which we've already included in everything we've brought here tonight, that they would not be, and if they had a Section 8 inspection, that would count as our inspection. If they had some sort of verification that showed that they've had the same tenant since the conception of the rental licensing program, they would not be subject to the safety inspection.
And, right.
Okay.
And if they can't verify it, then they have, then, you know, they'll have 60 days plus a year, or whatever July 1st of 19 is, when we start enforcing the changes, right? I mean, that's what you have on the last page.
It's the time schedule I need to kind of put everything together.
I
there.
understand
can't-
that.
I can't
Well,
do it.
trust me, I understand.
You've been doing a lot of stuff.
Yeah, these letters wouldn't start until after July 1.
Correct. The letters would not start after July 1 because we would have to comprise the list first and then start.
Sure.
If we identify who the priorities are, then they would get the things out to us.
Buying
So
time
it
left
would-
and right.
It's significant time down the line. Okay, so I guess for an easier topic, I'm saying that jokingly. All right, so we have the revocation of the provision. So we just covered the first one of what the inspection schedule would be, that of revoking. The last time we got together, the direction that we received was that a revoked or denied license shall have all of the units vacated, and we came up with the 60 days is what other jurisdictions did. Again, there would be a point system to do that, so we make sure there would be consistency in implementing this type of a program, and that it would be reviewed by the administration staff, meaning not the inspectors, that like myself, Kathy, and other administration staff would review these things before a license would be revoked. So it couldn't be the thing of saying that a particular inspector was targeting me to get my property revoked. So we came up with a point system for that. And those are the items that were listed. Essentially, it's the violations associated with the safety inspection. And we're taking into consideration during these that if you had a certain number of safety violations, you're not earning any points. You're just basically, we're saying, okay, if you have 3 safety violations at your property, you're not earning any points. So if you didn't have a smoke detector, you're not earning a point. If you didn't have a ground fault, you're not earning a point. If you had something wrong with your water heater, you're not earning a point. It's only when you got that 4th item. So you have 4 safety items out of that list of 12 I gave you. You have something there. Now you're actually earning some sort of point. And then
So points are bad.
points are bad.
Okay.
And so, kind of like on a license, I guess. So then we would have our unreported tenant turnovers. Again, we would monitor those through different means outside of the utility stuff. Municipal infraction citations, which would be fines. Those are not notices. Those are actual fines that are issued. If you actually received a fine from our office, you would earn some points. The excessive use of city services where actual fee was issued. So it's not saying an actual notice is issued. It's saying we actually issued a fee for those. And then the property taxes go unpaid for more than 180 days. And that the rental license registration fees were liened or paid, which is approximately 120 days out there, because we're trying to tout good property ownership. So this is saying that these people that would earn points in this system would be considered
A bad property
a bad property owner. So basically, as you did your total points, we would have properties that would be in good standing. Then we would issue warning letters to people if they earned a certain point level, and then we would revoke a license if they earned another level. I went back and reviewed the 2017, 2018 licenses. I was like, okay, if we had everyone that fell into that category, again, it's only a computer review. I didn't do a manual review of each of them. Where would we have these properties fall if they fell into this point scale? We had 13 that would receive a warning letter and 0 would have been revoked. So we're not creating a point system that is going to revoke everyone, but we're creating a system that would actually address the problem situations that we're saying that are out there.
It has a hammer hanging out there. If you don't
Correct.
comply,
This is a
then
helpful
this could
guide, I would
happen.
imagine, you know, I would think.
And, well, a prime example is I had one property kept on coming up on the list. I was wondering why they're coming up on the list. So then I actually took time to look at it to kind of see why do they keep on appearing on my list here, and it was one that actually they registered as a 3-unit when the program first started. They decreased it to 2 units later on, then they decreased it to 1 unit. And I looked at everything, I'm like, wait a second, they have tenants inside these places, but it's a landlord that put off the electric in their names. But you can kind of tell by looking at usage and that type of stuff, if someone's occupying it. We have unreported turnover, so I could see that they fell into the category. So the categories kind of work out here where we wouldn't revoke anyone. The revoked are only going to be the really bad situations at properties. Our goal is to, like Kathy said, to create that hammer so that if they aren't following the rules, there's a potential of
So
getting
we'll
revoked.
get their attention when they get the warning letter and they don't just go, oh, that's nice.
The goal is not to revoke, that's not what we're trying to do.
Correct. That's coming from ourselves and from the inspection staff. We don't want to revoke licenses, and we don't want to condemn places. We want everyone to have a place to live. It's the conditions of the properties that create these scenarios, and that's what we follow through with. Any comments on that one? Because we warned you out. So, all right, so the program exemptions, there was, before we always had the exemption in the ordinance for the new construction. These are one of these that we've talked about before, that it didn't seem like there was any reasons not to move forward with these particular ones. And this was one that, as Kathy and I and other staff have worked with property owners, have done renovations to these properties, have brought them to what we consider a high standard. We don't have an exemption clause for them. For example, like our student housing across the street that spent a lot of money renovating them to a high quality standard, they were immediately into our rental licensing program because there was no way to exempt them because it wasn't a new structure. So it's creating an exemption for existing properties that meet the PEP standards, issuing the following of the certificate of occupancy. An item that we talked about before was also the leaning of the license fees. It's all in our other licensing programs that we have. It's just not in this ordinance, so it's just kind of closing that loop. That it's the other license program that we have.
Another bad landlord issue.
And another item that we talked about was the transfer fee, that there would be a $25 per license transfer if the property transferred to a new owner or property management company and the department wasn't made aware of it in 30 days, then there would be a license fee applied. If it went unreported for a transfer for 60 days, then they would apply for a new license. Then if it was associated with the actual annual registration renewal time period, which is basically May 1 to June 30th, those are the ones that are in compliance. We still have people registering to this day, but those are the ones that have met the guidelines and have registered or renewed prior to the expiration of their current license, that those transfers associated with that would not be subject to any type of fee. The purpose of this is to potentially have that. It's a small hammer, but essentially something, you gotta tell us when the property transfers. We can't just be sitting back. SDAT does not update that quickly. Utility bills are due, but it's one of those things that we're not monitoring utility bills. That's not our department to monitor utility bills when things have changed. So it's to make people responsible. If it's a new management company, we get so many calls from our office that I no longer manage that anymore. I'm no longer the owner of this, and I haven't owned it since whatever time period. Well, no one tells us those things until we send them a letter. And so it's kind of hit or miss on that type of stuff. So it's trying to create something so that it's out there. A lot of jurisdictions have transfer fees, and majority of them don't do transfer licenses. They actually just make you reapply. One of the other items that we had mentioned before was including dormitory. Granted, we don't have any dormitories currently in Hagerstown, but it's just kind of cleaning up that part so that if we do get any dormitories in town, we can address it through the program to make sure people have safe housing.
On that particular item, so what will still be excluded are those other types of living.
Like reach.
Yeah.
Curb.
But like, what about the place that obviously was in the paper recently, I guess there was a dormitory style building down near the library that's now going to be something else?
The dormitory was never in the rental licensing program when it was. The new occupancy would not be required to be licensed in this program.
Because why?
Because it's, from a zoning standpoint, it'd be considered a hospital, and the hospitals are not a rental license type facility.
So how long of a stay
is required. Let's take the W House or Wells House, and I don't know how each of those work in the program. Is there a term, length of time? Is there any of those entities included in the program?
W House is in the program.
Wells House?
No.
So I guess I'm just trying to figure out how you pick and choose which one is and which one isn't.
So the Wells House that has properties, like over on Baltimore Street, they're not inspected by us.
Correct.
Because,
Back at the time of the adoption of the ordinance, they provided us documentation that showed that they were a transient nature, so therefore they were.
and I guess that's what I'm trying to
not
figure
subject-
out.
Right, what makes
is
them
what's
transient, what's the
transient?
time period, right?
Because you could probably look at the numbers and I don't know, I mean, I could be totally wrong here, but you hear this place down here is talking about folks for 30 days. I don't know what the term is for W House, I don't know what the term limit is, you know, for folks in Wells House, and every other one of these living quarters, that's the you know, the basic gist of it. In each one of these places, it's hard for me to understand how we pick and choose when we use a term, I guess, as nebulous as transient.
Well, it was associated with the treatment, care, and facilities, that type of stuff, because those were non-attended, because it was interpreted as a care facility that was not part of the ordinance.
Like nursing homes are not
Like
part of the
a
ordinance.
nursing home's not part
That's
of it.
specifically spelled out as not being part of the ordinance.
So Holly Place
Right,
is not included.
right.
They're regulated by the state, is that correct?
Or licensed by the state.
We're making the assumption that they are receiving the same level of review on some scheduled basis of inspection
If we,
for those safety-related items.
we
For
only had.
nursing homes, yeah. I would assume for a nursing home. I'd be interested to see what their licensing requirements are.
I'd be interested to see which ones we're excluding and who they fall under to determine if we should, and I think
Oh,
it's
I
back to
understand
your original
that.
point of the safety-oriented thing. I mean, I'm looking at these 12 items, and I have to say to myself, you know, if we have a dozen of those places that aren't even getting the basics on some rolling schedule of just those 12 items, I can't understand how we have a program that is for some, if the goal, as you put it, is to make sure everybody has a safe place to live, and then we don't do it for others. And those others being, in some of these cases, the most vulnerable, you know, of the citizens that we're trying to assure that for.
We would
Do-
need
I
to
think that's
include
crazy.
nursing homes in the program if we were going to go after disabled types of housing.
All I'm saying is at some point, staff gives us a list of all of those that are excluded, at least that you can come up with, and that you can show to us why they're being excluded. Because if you're telling me that there's just an assumption that a state agency's reviewing it, or we can't verify that some state entity that's supposed to be doing it is doing it, then I think it's incumbent upon us to revisit them and say, you know, why is W House in and Wells House out? You know, why is, I guess, Salvation Army?
They're not in the program. It all depends, because
The mission.
they're not in the program neither. You get into different ones because of how the units are used and stuff there. So, because they're traditionally classified as a homeless shelter, but some of Salvation Army is a single-family home. Those are in, so it just depends on how the use is. But the reason why we only went with dormitory is because the last time we were here, there wasn't a full support for anything other than pretty much
understand that.
dormitory. So that's why we just went with the dormitory. As far as the discussion, we can come back at a later date to discuss the other issues, types of things, but, all right.
I'd just like to see a list of the 50 that aren't, and who's supposed to be doing that.
I guess for helping for us on some of those, it's knowing what entities we're kind of, guess, looking at. So I guess we can always seek further clarification on those, but I don't know if we want to head down that path tonight. How about that for you all?
No one wants to go down that path.
Separate from this effort, so this can move on,
Yeah,
because
I-
there's clearly not support for, if you start going down into the weeds too far in this type of area. That was when things
I
started
think
to
that we're
blow
all
up
making
last
significant
time.
assumptions at this point, is why there's not support.
I'm assuming you don't have a lot of support, so let's move forward.
The last slide that we have tonight, which I'm sure Jen probably wanted to hear me to say, was, so we will be looking at any of these changes to be an introduction on August 28th. And it looks like the biggest point of discussion was this prioritization, but I think we worked out something where everyone can agree to it. So I still see that August 28th being an introduction. The passage would be on September 25th, but the effective date of all these changes would not be till July 1st, 2019. Gives us time to educate everyone, get the stuff out there to people, get us the verification list, so then we can have a solid program moving forward, knowing where we have to address certain issues, and can start compiling the things to get the letters and everything out to people and start working through it.
So the July
That's
1st
good.
would be for everything, including like leaning and all that stuff?
Yeah, just I think for an easier purpose for everyone, July 1st would be for everyone.
Cool, sounds good.
Thank you, good work.
Yeah.
I
Yeah,
think
great,
so.
great work.
But I'm all in favor of the thing that Austin is proposing. Isn't that the shutting down the drug houses?
Yeah,
That's what
Jen's gonna talk about it.
Whether we can do that or not.
Right. So far, what I've read, it doesn't look like that's
Yes.
direction.
Hi, everyone.
Hey, we're gonna inspect them now.
So, I was directed to look into some options, what our options were with regards to how to deal with, properties in the city that, we've had issues with, I think specifically drug use. And so I've included in the packet, one of the options that we were, addressing was new legislation. New legislation may be possible, but I believe that the current legislation that we have both at the state level and in our code will deal with most of the problems to the extent that we are able to. Should I keep going or should I
Yeah, keep going.
wait? Okay.
Well, Kristen's not coming back, so.
No, Kristen is.
You had to leave.
So, there are some various criminal statutes, addressing possession with intent to distribute, drug houses or common nuisance. I'm not going to get into those. Those would have to be prosecuted by the state's attorney's office. And to the best of my knowledge, when the facts are appropriate, they do charge them. Within the city code, we have several ordinance dealing with nuisances, not involving the use of drugs. I'll just mention chapter 185, which is nuisance abatement dealing with weeds, grass, trash, rubbish. I'm sorry, I'm trying to go quickly. Chapter 187, nuisance and abandoned property abatement. Those would be structurally unsound, unsuitable for habitation. The city can pursue obtaining a court order declaring the property a nuisance and authorizing the city to abate the nuisance conditions or demolish the property at the owner's cost. And then what I included in the packet is the Maryland Annotated Code, Real Property Article 14-120. This is actually a statute that has been in existence for quite some time, and it has been addressed or utilized to a little degree in our city at times. I know that there was a period of time where the narcotics task force was pursuing these at a lower level. I'm not aware, my institutional knowledge does not indicate that any proceedings have been filed in the court system, but perhaps dating back or I'm just not aware of it. But the real property article does permit a municipality or gives a municipality a tool for abating nuisances as defined in the statute. And as it's defined, it does address prostitution or houses of prostitution. I didn't go into that in my memo. We could certainly pursue it if the appropriate case arises. But I looked at it more from the standpoint of CDS. So a nuisance is defined as a property that is used, one, for the illegal manufacture or distribution of controlled dangerous substance or controlled paraphernalia, and those are both defined in the code. Two, for the illegal storage or concealment of CDS in a sufficient quantity to reasonably indicate an intent to manufacture, distribute, or dispense CDS or controlled paraphernalia, or 3, by persons who assemble for the specific purpose of illegally administering CDS. If we have a property that we believe meets the definition of a nuisance, the municipality is authorized to pursue abatement of the nuisance properties by filing proceedings in the District Court of Maryland against, we can pursue the owner, we can pursue the operator, so this could include property management companies, and/or we can include the tenant. You have to file suit, get proper notice, post the property, and then there would be a hearing in the district court. If the court determines that a nuisance exists, then the court may order any appropriate injunctive or equitable relief. So we can't pursue monetary damages this way, but I don't think that's what we're interested in doing anyway. We're interested in trying to figure out how to stop that activity at the property. This can include ordering a tenant to vacate the property within 72 hours if the court finds that the tenant knew or should have known of the existence of the nuisance. If the court finds that the owner and/or operator knew or should have known of the existence of the nuisance, the court may order the owner or operator to submit a corrective plan. There's some case law out there interpreting this statute. In relevant part, that the case law is pretty clear that the courts will and should only go as far as absolutely necessary to achieve the desired result. So if that is removing the tenant, or if that is implementing a corrective plan, if the corrective plan, for example, is has to do with, I don't know, an all-night diner and it's creating a nuisance with the level of the noise, then it could be, and I'm actually referring to a case, it's not necessarily no music after hours, it would be turn the music down. So again, we're looking at the least sort of restrictive or intrusive way to correct the problem. However, if there is not compliance with the court's order, then the court may order, if it's the tenant who's not complying, the court may order restitution of the property to the owner or operator. If the owner or operator does not comply with the court's order, then the owner may be found in contempt, and there's also a process for the court to order that the property be sold or demolished if it's unfit for habitation and the cost of rehabilitation exceeds the estimated market value of the property. So demolition is probably going to be a pretty far stretch, and we also have our an ordinance dealing with those types of properties. So I think that this statute, I've looked at the West Virginia Martinsburg Drug House Ordinance. I think that this statute gives us as much, or perhaps more, as adopting legislation ourselves. I think what is important to note about any tools that we have at our disposal, we have to be able to tie the activity to the property. And I think the police department has been looking into or doing some analyzing of data with respect to certain properties and how many calls we get and what types of calls those are. So before we were to institute one of these types of cases, we would want to sit down and just look at factually what are we looking at, what's going on at this property, and do we believe that this is an appropriate case? Do we have the evidence to pursue a suit under this statute?
So Jen, so that means that we have the ability already through this state statute. We don't have to adopt legislation that's similar to it or anything. We already have the authority. Okay, that's great.
We have the authority to have the court decide to take the least restrictive action.
Yes.
That's what we have the authority of.
Yes.
Yeah. So we have no authority. Basically.
Well, but if they're not complying, then the court gets.
Yeah.
And if the
If the court determines.
if it's that much of a trouble area, the likelihood that they're not gonna comply, to me, is probably pretty.
And my point there is to illustrate that we can't jump to selling the property. That we'll have to go through some procedural hoops, even if it's clear that that's the only way this is going to stop. We'll still have to go through the process. I can tell you that maybe approximately 2 years ago, our office was working with the task force. They provided us with a couple of cases. They were utilizing the statute, and then they made a decision not to. So they contacted our office and asked us to send letters to the property owners with respect to a couple of tenants who had been charged with criminal offenses that would qualify the property as a nuisance. And I think I sent 3 letters, and I heard back from at least 2, if not 3 of the owners, and they'd said, look, these tenants have already been evicted. So it can also be a proactive tool, again, you know, under the right circumstances, without having to actually go through the process of filing suit.
We may want to find out. I can tell you that from a historical perspective, it goes back some time, but the state's attorney's office did handle this, and Brett Wilson was the nuisance attorney for the state's attorney's office under a state or federal grant.
Well, now it's Mark, right? And, who's handling that? There still is one. Chief, who's handling, who's our contact at the state's attorney's office that handles nuisance abatement?
At NTF, yeah, but they had a specific, Brett
Yeah, Brett was,
specifically,
yeah.
I don't know if they, I don't know that they still have a.
Did they replace Brett Wilson with anybody as far as?
I don't think so. No.
Okay.
No, they don't.
All right.
Right.
Okay, all right. I guess all I can say is okay.
So I guess when I had sent this to Chief right after he got sworn in, the West Virginia one that you referred to. And it's, I think they're on their like 26th house this year that they shut down. Can we do that with us?
Yeah, is that what you're asking us?
I mean,
Do we want to
is
do
that, I mean.
So yes.
If you, yeah, I mean, I think, you know, the first, taking the first step is going to show us how this ends up working if we are resolving issues in that sort of, we'll call it the settlement stage, or if we are actually having to file suit and how those are being received by the courts. I think that we certainly have the tools here. I would say yes. I mean, I think we have the tools here if we're not getting compliance, and by compliance, I mean getting the nuisance abated, whether it's a property that is being used to grow house, or drugs are being distributed out of there or stored there, or if it's being used you know, as a place of gathering. If we can substantiate, and it wouldn't be the criminal level of proof, it wouldn't be beyond a reasonable doubt, it'd be the civil level. Then again, the first step would be something like you know, a corrective plan, whether it's increasing security at the property, or putting up cameras, or better lighting, or something like that. And if that's not solving the issue, then we do have the authority to go back to the court and say, look, we need you to take a bigger step here. The only thing that will solve this is this property being sold. Or if the property is in such a dilapidated state that there's no way to secure it, or you know, these sorts of security measures don't make sense, then we could pursue, you know, the only way to stop this from being a den where people gather and use CDS would be to demolish it and completely take down the structure. I mean, if we have properties that meet that description, then this gives us the tools to take increasingly invasive measures to stop it.
So just so I understand completely, a controlled dangerous substance would be fentanyl.
Correct. They're,
It's
they're
defined as such
statutorily
by
defined,
the,
yes.
basically everybody. So if, basically everybody.
By the basically everybody. That's right.
Who knows anything of that? So if a structure is being used to house fentanyl and conceal it from law enforcement, then under the state statute, we can file a proceeding in the District Court of Maryland against the owner of that facility.
Correct.
And what we would, the only thing we could hope to obtain from that initially would be for the owner to submit a corrective plan.
Correct.
But if the owner submitted the corrective plan and then failed to follow through on it, at that point, we would be able to file another action?
We could pursue a contempt order, or a finding that they're in contempt. But we also have the authority to seek a court order that the property be sold.
Okay.
However, it's clear that is never going
That's
to
not
be
gonna
done
be easy.
unless there is total non-compliance.
Mhm.
And of course, the reality is, we don't really want to sell the property, we want compliance.
Yeah, really.
I mean, that's really what we want. Without mentioning the names, I know there's been discussions about one particular property in town, and I'd be very happy to find them in total compliance.
Right.
Instead of having to force a sale of the property.
Right.
But I think what Jen is telling us, and it's what I tell a lot of clients when you say, well, if I do this, you're just gonna get a slap on the wrist. The answer is, well, you can't get the punch in the face until after you get a couple slaps on the wrist.
yeah.
And if you never start with the slaps on the wrist, you're never gonna get anywhere.
Exactly.
Does this, or does the Martinsburg program, which I've read about in the paper, does it have an operation name? Does it have like a name to this type of program to be able to exit, or?
They call theirs their drug house ordinance, and it's just.
And we
They call
also,
this drug
keep
house
in mind,
nuisance
we
abatement.
have
This is abatement.
we
yeah,
have a
nuisance
nuisance
drug.
ordinance right now as it relates to landlords, right? I mean, we get calls for them doing that, they can get fined right now under the program we have in place. But it again involves more than one.
Yeah, they don't get fined the first time.
No.
Right.
Martinsburg's policy or ordinance, whatever they act under, I mean, what is, is it the first time, is it the third time? Is it-
Yeah, I have it. I'd have to, it's been a while since I read it. I can send it to you. But I mean, they've
Well-
shut it down. What they were finding is they had, I think what started it was they had a couple big drug busts, and they realized that all of them were owned by the same landlord. So,
Well, and I
Of
think
course,
it-
down.
the other issue is this is controlled by state law, so it's not
Right.
like.
West
Right,
Virginia state law
yeah.
Right.
is
But
different.
that's why I had sent it to Chief Kiefer when he first got sworn in and said, hey, this is what they have there. I keep reading about it in the paper. Is it comparable to what we have now? Or are there parts that we can take from this? And I think that this
Right.
just seems similar.
Well, and I
Because
can
there are
add-
parts that we can take from it that are illegal in Maryland. If it's working, why reinvent the wheel?
Right.
And I think that Martinsburg has gotten behind, the community's gotten behind and sees what,
Yeah.
what's happening, which, whatever it's called, would be nice for our community to kind of feel the same way, like, hey, look, we're taking action. And whatever that is defined as, operation, take action. All right. Don't, oh, he's gone, okay, good. The reporter. Not the name of it.
Okay, I can't feel my feet. It's so cold in here. Like, it's literally, my
getting
foot
late.
is purple.
Yeah.
Let's wrap it.
Any other questions for
Try to
Jen
find this one.
in this point.
Thanks, Jen.
Yeah, thank you, Jim.
Thank
So
you,
we'll
Jen.
utilize these tools that we have
Right.
as the
Yeah,
situation
so
comes.
we just need to,
Execute.
we need the
Yep.
surveillance to,
Yep.
step one is we need the surveillance, and step two, we need.
HPD is on it.
City Administrator, any comments tonight?
Just that this weekend, reminders, August-toberfest, Saturday and Sunday. Saturday begins at 11 to 10, and Sunday's 11 to 5. And I forget what, I think it's the 23rd. If I have that right? So it's a good weekend. It's a little bit earlier this year. 23rd.
18th and 19th.
I meant it's the 23rd August.
Oh, okay.
I'm sorry. It's the 8th, yeah.
Confuse everybody.
It's the 18th and 19th. The
Okay.
18th, this weekend, yes.
All right, thank you.
You're welcome.
Emily?
Just thanks to our Parks and Rec department that did the dash and splash. It was awesome. It was a lot of fun, but they only had about 50 runners. It was the first year. That's a pretty good turnout. Hopefully it'll grow. And the summer slide was a really good time. Wind down was really disappointing with attendance. And I know we just moved in.
University Plaza, what do you expect?
It was awesome. There's a great,
I'm
it was
just
a
telling you
great,
that's just, it's not the same ambiance that you
it
get
was,
on South
it's
Potomac.
awesome. There's no reason why there shouldn't have been
Okay.
higher attendance. I'm just, when people say they want free events, we're putting them on, you gotta show up. So, so the vendors wanna keep coming. But it was a great time. It wound down, the dogs were welcome, it was dog friendly, and I was just really disappointed with the turnout. So hopefully the next one will ramp back up.
I think there kind of was a threat of, wasn't there a little threat of rain too that Friday?
It was
Early.
beautiful.
Always been a threat of rain.
Yeah, yeah, every day there
You
is.
should be used to it.
Yeah.
Earlier there was, that's
Exactly.
right.
Austin?
Nothing tonight.
Lou?
Just real quickly, you know, Kristen kept talking during budget time about how we have to show our citizens where our money goes. This month's MML magazine, Aberdeen came up and they say,
No, I didn't
please
see
use,
that yet.
please use our program. And it's like a cartoon of the city showing where everything goes. And I just say this because it is very interesting to see, because we hear so much about how great a new baseball stadium would be and how much money it makes, and examples are always given, such as Aberdeen. According to Aberdeen's nice thing here, almost 4% of their entire general fund budget goes to nothing but the Ripken Stadium. They are spending $668,000 a year in general fund money, in addition to their total the total yearly cost for Ripken Stadium for Aberdeen is $975,000 a year. Of that, $668,000 is general fund, and the balance is hotel tax. So with all of these things, whether it's a stadium, and I don't mean just to say stadiums, or an indoor sportsplex, let's be aware that some places do great and some places don't do so great, and that was with a benefactor. And everything was wonderful in the city this week. Congratulations to staff and Crumpy's Donut Run. While we didn't get a lot of runners at the Splash, they did at Crumpy's. Thank you.
Shelley?
Just two quick things. I'd like to just go back to the goal setting. I'm hoping that we can maybe communicate via email to select a date. Maybe we can do a doodle poll. I'm not really sure how that would work, that we'd all kind of come together and decide, but I'd like to see that.
Staff is ready whenever you all are ready, so just pick your dates.
I think he works out of town, so
Yeah.
we gotta figure out what day he's available, but.
Do
I'm
we want
flexible.
1 or 2 days?
One.
One day?
Yeah.
Okay, so a
We can always
Saturday.
do another day if we need to.
Yeah.
Well, that's what we did last year.
Well,
Last year we had it
If Tuesdays
in
are good.
July, and then we
for
had another one in
you,
August.
You can do it early. I mean, it doesn't have to be at 4 o'clock. You could do it at noon or 10 o'clock.
I guess that's up
I
to
think we
Kristen's
need
schedule.
yeah.
Yeah, so maybe we'll just send a doodle poll email, something like that. And I was at a meeting last night and received a huge compliment for Beth Everhart.
Oh, yeah.
She really, and I've spent the day with her on cutoff day, and which was very encouraging to see how she handles everything, but she really went above and beyond for a citizen in the community, and I think she should be highly commended. It was her day off, and she called and made sure that he got what he needed, and I really think that speaks volumes. I think that it's not just her, there's many, many members of staff that don't receive, a great pat on the back. At least the community can kind of think that the city of Hagerstown is against them, but there's a lot of people here that do some pretty tremendous things. So.
But customer service is key on everybody's mind.
Yeah, so thanks to Beth.
I will pass that along.
Yes, thank you.
Chief, when are we going to get back together again about the conversation that you and Captain Langston and I had at breakfast over a month ago? Quality of life.
Well, Captain Langston here, we can get together next week.
Okay. All right. Okay. That's all I have. We're adjourned.